Hey, good morning, everyone. So, welcome to week 3 of the advanced 10-week course. I'm really excited for this session because we'll be talking about something unrelated to honeybees, so native pollinators. And so, Keegan, he'll introduce himself, but he's a graduate student at Texas A&M University with Dr. Juliana Rangel's lab. And he does a lot of honeybee work, but he has a really well knowledge in native pollinators, something that I don't know as much about. So I'm really excited for him to be here to talk about native pollinators. And at the final part of the session, I will be talking about just kind of bees around the world. So we'll talk about the corbiculate bees and some of the different apis bees. I think they're really fascinating, so I'm excited to talk about that. And just a little teaser for you guys to wait till the end. I'll talk about how there's some evidence that honeybees might be native to the U.S. Who knows? We're still learning more, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So, yeah, so I sent you guys an email about potential volunteer opportunities, and so we have the Houston Livestock Rodeo, and so they're looking for people to volunteer at their booth. San Antonio, they're having an Earth Day, and so they asked us if the master beekeepers wanted to have a booth at the San Antonio Earth Day event. And so if you're interested, please let me know. I haven't signed up yet because I haven't gotten any volunteers, but if you want to collect some volunteer hours, that's definitely a really great opportunity. Also, Texas A&M, their garden, I think it's the 25th of April or so. But I think they have about 300 vendors, and they asked the master beekeepers if they want to have a booth. I think it's from 10 to 2 on April 25th, but I can give you more information. So if you're in the College Station area and you want to run the master beekeeper booth, please let me know. That's another really great opportunity. Otherwise, if you're looking for any other opportunities, just let me know. I can find you something. I had a lot of people reach out to me about transcribing those old documents from the 1800s. So thank you for doing that. Um, it's really great to have this really cool county by county data about honey production in Texas, and it'd be cool to see how things have changed for the past 150 years. And so, if you're interested in transcribing it, I think Larry, you might be on the call. He did it. Um, Larry wasn't so bad, was it? It only took you about an hour. Okay. Yeah. So Larry did it. Only took about an hour to do one, and we're pretty much done with everything. So if you want to help out, that's a really great way to get a few public service credits. So, but yeah, if anybody in the group has other volunteer opportunities that you want to share to the rest of the group, please let me know. I'm happy to share it with everybody. So before we begin, I want to introduce Lauren Ward. She is a new program specialist in Angleton, Texas. If you don't know where Angleton is, it's about an hour south of Houston. But really, it's a really great master gardener setup, but also a location for bees and apiary programs. So I'll let Lauren introduce herself and her role and her location and some of her plans.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. As Dr. Slater said, so I'm the new program specialist down here in Angleton, so just south of Houston. I see some names already I'm familiar with, and brand new. So this is week 2. So I'm really excited to be part of the Texas Master Beekeeper program and everything else we get into here. So I don't know it all yet, but I'm quite excited. So.
And what would be nice about having Lauren in Houston is we can offer more testing in the Houston area. So we'll be giving her all the testing set up. And so obviously her apiary will be in Angleton. But if you have a club like in Fort Bend County or Montgomery or Harris County and you want her to come up and do any testing, we can definitely make that happen. If you really want to make the testing really more accessible, and having Lauren in place will make that a lot easier. And so if you're in Houston, Austin, we can make something happen. So Lauren, do you want to maybe just put your A&M email in the chat just so everybody has it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think we'll get started. So we have Keegan, and I'll let Keegan introduce himself, but he's, I guess, a PhD student, almost a PhD candidate here pretty shortly, depending on if he passes his exam or not. So I guess we'll see. But he definitely has a wealth of knowledge of native bees and native pollinators, and so I wanted to bring him in. That's one part I don't feel comfortable speaking on all the native pollinators, and I really want to bring Keegan in. He's a really great public speaker and really knowledgeable about native pollinators. So, yeah, Keegan, there's the floor.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and My name is Keegan Nichols. I'm a third-year PhD student. I'm a part of Dr. Juliana Rangel's lab here at Texas A&M. And I do, like, my thesis project is actually establishing a breeding program over in Saudi Arabia with their native honeybee. So I still like to joke that I'm still in native bees, even though I study honeybees. My background is actually in native bees. I did a native bee biodiversity survey in my undergraduate work up in near Sherman in Grayson County, if anybody's up there. But yeah, that's where I got, like, that's how I first got started in bees in general. I really fell in love with their biodiversity, and I really love their environmental interactions. So that's kind of like how I got my wealth of knowledge in native bees, just through that. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with non-bees and their pollinators and their services that they use. So just a big overview of this entire presentation. We'll go through the Lone Star pollinators. Pretty much we'll go through pollination, the philosophy behind that, and non-bee diversity. And then we'll get into characteristics of bees, like the anatomy and morphology, how they live, the sociality spectrum, and nesting behavior. All these bees have a very different lifestyle. And then we'll actually get into the biodiversity. We'll get into families and other cool species. And then finally, we'll end with how to support honeybees and native bees. After all, we're trying to support everybody in the environment because we are still beekeepers. We want to have room for everybody. So pollination is simply the movement of pollen from one flower to another. It can be done through a multitude of different ways, either through animal mediated, where an animal of any kind of species gathers the pollen and then moves it to another flower, through wind pollination, water as well, and then also some flowers have the ability to self-pollinate. And our pollinators come in a wide variety. They can come in mammals in the terms of like rodents. Bats are also great pollinators for a lot of cacti in the area. And then also lemurs out in Madagascar. It's been shown that they can also serve as pollinators for some of the native plants and flowers over there. Birds, especially hummingbirds, especially some as like honey creepers or orioles, and insects in butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies. Basically, a pollinator, you can be defined as a pollinator as long as you're moving a grain of pollen from one flower to another. So people have looked into ants as pollinators, cotton leafhoppers as pollinators, any kind of animal that interacts with the anther of the pollen that might have this indirect pollination. And so also, so like, why, you may be asking, like, why is there such diversity in our pollinators? And this goes back to the coevolution between flowers and the animals that they interact with. These traits play within each other. So a flower may have a deeper or longer flower, and so the nectar is deeper within that. And so that the nectar provides the rewards for the animal that is actually visiting that flower. So the longer the tube of the flower, the longer the tongue or the proboscis or the beak or tongue of the bat, for example, has to be to access those rewards and therefore come in contact with the pollen. So these traits play into each other. So the longer the tube, the longer the flower, and eventually that gets selected for in the bee or in the flower, and then the speciation starts to happen between the organisms. So other traits, so like body shape, mouth shape, food preference, behavior, pollination behavior is also a large factor in which organisms can actually pollinate different flowers. And some of the flower traits are color, scent, shape, pollen amount, and nectar amount. As we know, bees are very smart, and so they're able to learn which flowers actually present the best pollen rewards and the best nectar rewards. So these also are selected for within the flowers that they pollinate. But then now we're going to get into more of kind of the diversity of non-bees. So we'll start off with butterflies and moths. They're in the order Lepidoptera, which means scale wings. So actually all of their wings are covered in these little scales, which gives them their color. They're considered indirect pollinators. So indirect means that they're not actually targeting the pollen when they visit these flowers. They're more targeting the nectar of the flowers, and they're indirectly coming in contact with the pollen and may indirectly carry that pollen to another flower. They really prefer long trumpet-shaped flowers, and they look for flowers that produce ample amount of nectar, such as morning glory, tobacco, yucca, and gardenia. So only the adults feed on nectar, but larvae can be significant agricultural pests. So a lot of the really the pests that we're trying to target to eliminate, such as like tobacco hornworm, they actually grow up to be actually quite beautiful moss. So it's kind of like that. Wish you didn't have one without the other. And then so the difference between a moth and a butterfly. So moths are mostly nocturnal. They're largely stockier and hairier. They're more fuzzy, and they also have fuzzier antenna compared to butterflies, which are more clubbed at the end. And they're usually duller and more cryptic colors because they have to blend in the daytime against predators. And butterflies are mostly diurnal, and they're more slender and smooth. So some of the significant moths that we have. So by far the most significant pollinator family is the sphinx moths, or Sphinxidae. These are the big ones. These are like your tobacco hornworms. They're really quite beautiful, and when you actually get to see one in person, you actually get to like how big they actually are. These guys have really long tongues, so they're able to access these long tubular flowers that some of these other bees and organisms cannot actually get to. Some of the other ones are owlet moths and tiger moths. And so it's interesting, these guys are attracted to more white flowers because they are more nocturnal. These white flowers reflect more of the moonlight at night. And so they're better able to see these flowers. And some of like the other stories that are really significant, I know I was talking about how moths are indirect pollinators, but there's the yucca moth that I know that's in the chapter that Dr. Slater sent out. That's actually a specialist relationship that has developed where the yucca moth has now developed this specialist pollinator relationship with the yucca flower. And that plant would not exist if that relationship did not develop. And so significant butterflies, we're probably seeing these guys skipping around your gardens. So skippers, especially, they're really early in the season. They're smaller butterflies, and they pollinate some of the smaller flowers. The Mexican blue wing is a primary pollinator of certain species of milkweed flowers, especially in the south. And they're part of the family Nymphalidae. And then another specialist relationship is the pipevine swallowtail. The Papilionidae is the family of swallowtail butterflies. So this also includes other large ones, such as the tiger swallowtail, which is the large black and yellow butterfly that you've probably seen around, I mean, especially in Central Texas. So these are some of the other major families. And then some of the other really cool ones is obviously the Texas state insect, the monarch. But it also has two other like cryptic species, the viceroy and the queen butterfly. These guys are all great pollinators of milkweed flowers. But a lot of times, like when I'm walking around with other students, they'll say, oh, it's a monarch, but it's not that right time of the year for the monarchs to be migrating through. And it's like, oh, it's actually a queen, or it's actually a viceroy. So I always like to point that out, that there's other butterflies that look exactly like our monarch butterfly. But the monarch butterfly has recently found itself in the endangered category, according to the Xerces Society. There's a large amount of population decline, and this is partly because they're vast migrating travels. And this is also really important for milkweed diversity. Like we were saying, they're great pollinators of milkweed, and these guys travel great distances. And so they're actually picking up these pollen granules that could make it far enough where this population of milkweed is actually becoming healthier through this biodiversity and this great travel of pollen through the United States and down into Mexico. And so there's now more conservation efforts. Like I know there's some butterfly conservation efforts, I think in Japan, where there's not this great migrationary things, but there's been suggestions of it where you put these big mesh fences over highways and other structures so that butterflies can't fly into cars and trucks and hit their windshield. But rather they just fly into this mesh and then go up and around the highway traffic. So it's still in preliminary talks, and so we'll see how that goes from there. So the next family of beetles, or the next family of our pollinators, is the order Coleoptera, or our beetles. Coleoptera means sheath wing. It's actually one of the first pollinators ever in our evolutionary history. They're one of the first pollinators in the Cretaceous period, and they fed mostly on gymnosperms, collecting pollen and eating that. They're considered dirty pollinators, so they're actually just targeting the pollen for protein. So they're getting all up in the flowers and they're eating it and inadvertently covering themselves in this pollen, and they're traveling from plant to plant, tree to tree. And they're how they're termed dirty pollinators. They're attracted to flowers that emit like musky. They don't smell as sweet as the typical flower would, and so this is what attracts the beetles. And then going back to our coevolution, flowers that depend on these beetles have been selected for to smell a little nasty, and so they attract more of these beetles to help pollinate themselves. And then the most famous quote by our entomologist J.B.S. Haldane is, "God has an inordinate fondness for beetles. Beetles are the most diverse order of insects, with over 400,000 species discovered, with even more being discovered every day. And the amount of beetles comparatively to the insect biomass is over half." And the term for pollination by beetles is called canthrophily. And some of the great families that do this is Cambricidae, which is the longhorn beetles, especially the flower longhorn beetle. It is considered a wasp/bee mimic. So you might see it on your flower if you're passing by. It's like, oh, that was a bee or a wasp. It's actually a beetle. And you can see him up here being covered in this pollen that he's eaten. Some of the other great families are Cantharidae, or the soldier beetles. They actually have predatory larvae, so they actually have twofold benefit to have in our gardens and our systems. Their larvae will actually go through and eat soft-bodied insects such as aphids and other plant pests, and so they're clearing it up, making the ecosystem also healthier while also pollinating the plants as adults. Other great ones are the scarab beetles, or Scarabidae. They are great pollinators of magnolias, cycads, and water lilies. Beetles are really attracted to large disc-shaped flowers that are white because they don't have these morphological structures to actually get down in these tubular type flowers. And so they want like flatter things so that it's easily access to the pollen. So the next order, actually, this is a really great order for our pollination. Flies, or Diptera, it means two-winged. They only have two pairs of wings. They would contribute over $300 billion worth of pollination services yearly worldwide. There's actually explored for commercially managed species because they're such good pollinators. There's been recent studies where they're actually on par with bees for pollination efficiency. And they're actually key pollinators of cacao, mango, cashew, avocado, and oilseed rape. So these guys are really, there's different families, which we'll get into a little bit later, of these guys that are actually specific pollinators. So they're not that typical fly where they're laying their eggs on decaying material and they're eating it through that, but they're actually laying them on flowers, and they have predatory larvae as well. And so it's going back to the beetles, where they have predatory larvae, having that twofold benefit in the ecosystem themselves. And they're also targeting pollen for their main protein source as well. And they're also covered in these hairs compared to some of the other orders that we were just talking about aren't covered in hairs, so they don't have that benefit of that extra moving the pollen around. So fly morphology, so going back to that diptera or the two wings, they only have two wings. Right back here are called halteres. These are used for flight stability. And you can tell them apart. They kind of look like a male drone, honestly. They have these big fly eyes that touch in the middle. They have really short antennae. And a lot of the pollinating flies also mimic wasps or bees, especially as we get into the families. So the two main big pollinating families are Mobilidae, which are bee flies. They actually look kind of like a big bumblebee. They're really super cute. They look flying, and they also have this long forward proboscis that they cannot retract. So that's a great identifying factor if you were to see one in your garden. So it's specialized for nectar. It's these guys are only feeding on nectar, and they're also abundant in fields and croplands. But our big family is the hoverflies, or Syrphidae, or syrphid flies, was another name for them. They're really important, especially in higher altitude and latitudes, because this is where bees start to become less abundant. And so flowers and other plants in these areas and ecosystems don't have access to these bees. And so they've actually been selected for based on these hoverflies, these hoverfly pollinations. And syrphids prefer yellow and white diurnal flowers, but they actually have been shown to visit a larger variety of flowers than honeybees. They're actually more general than our favorites. And these guys are becoming an increased interest as larvae are predators. And so they're having that twofold benefit as well. And syrphid flies are the commercially interested species for possible pollination. And so now we're going to move into Hymenoptera, which is our favorite family. This includes bees, wasps, and ants, which we'll talk about a little bit later as we get into the next part of the presentation. But so they're a part of Hymenoptera. That means membrane wing. So they have a large variety of sociality as well. They can be solitary, they can be social, and they can also be parasitoids. These solitary and basically all of them are predators, so they're feeding on live insects. A wasp is basically a carnivorous bee. Instead of trying to collect pollen to help rear their young, they're collecting caterpillars and anything that they might catch to then feed to their larvae. They're indirect pollinators, so this means that they're not directly targeting pollen, and so when they come into contact, when they feed on this nectar, they're indirectly moving these pollen grains, sorry. And they help control pest populations. So these guys are really great to have in our agriculture. There's a lot of biological control systems that we're looking into to help control some of these agriculturally important pests, especially on the parasitoids side. Like there's been, and so significant solitary wasps is the tarantula hawk wasp, one of the largest wasps, and the most painful sting according to the Schmidt pain scale. And you're going to need a painful sting if you're going to hunt big tarantulas and then drag them back to your nest. Their life cycle is super interesting. They'll go out and hunt for these tarantulas. When they sting them, they'll actually paralyze them. And so that tarantula that's being dragged right there is still alive. She'll drag her back to her burrow and then lay an egg on top of this tarantula and then cover it up. And so when that egg hatches, that larva will then eat that tarantula throughout her development. And so that tarantula will get eaten alive, basically. So quite extreme. And so mud daubers is a really broad term. It can refer to Crabronidae, which are our digger wasps, or Sphaecidae, which is more the thread-waisted wasp, which you can see pictured here. These guys are like, you may see them around the corners of your barns, buildings, or anything like that. I had a mud dauber create her own nest in my window one time in between the screen and the glass. So that was very interesting to watch her go in and out carrying spiders and other mud and dirt to create her nest. And you can see like the cross section of this nest right here. It's filled with different spiders, caterpillars, and other insects, which she'll then lay her eggs upon, and they'll hatch and then eat this great morsel that her mom has provided. So parasitoids is probably the most hardcore life cycle of any hymenopteron. It's an organism that lives and develops in a host at the host's expense. So every time a parasitoid is going to hatch, it's going to hatch out of something, and they keep it alive for the longest time possible. So they'll eat all the other tissues besides the organs. So the host organism will live for the longest time possible. And these guys are really broken down into two main parasitoid families, Braconidae and Echimonidae. These guys are one of the most diverse families in the insect world, especially Braconidae. It's the second largest family in Hymenoptera. And this great diversity comes from their speciality in their host's preference. So you can see a pictured Braconidae laying her egg in an aphid, and some of these Braconidae species will then specialize on certain aphid species. And then Echimonidae, these guys have these great long ovipositors, which they'll actually have to coil up inside their abdomens and then insert and saw them into logs to find like beetle larvae or other larvae that are found in logs. And the bad thing about these guys sometimes in the terms of our world is that they can sometimes be parasitoids of solitary bees. So some of these native pollinators can become prey to these guys. So actually, when I had a project in my undergrad where we hatched out blue orchard mason bees. And sometimes we'd have parasitoid wasps hatch instead out of these cocoons instead of bees. And so these guys were getting parasitized as well, especially in managed solitary bee spaces. So significant solitary or social wasps, or most of them are going to be in Vespidae. These guys are going to be truly eusocial, or they're going to be eusocial. And these guys come in like many forms. So red paper wasp, metric paper wasp, and the cutest name is Hunter's little paper wasp. You might see them flying around the apiary, and especially the guinea paper wasp. And what's significant about these guys is that this was actually earlier this year. I took off the lids of one of our boxes out at the apiary, and all these wasps are actually foundress queens for this next upcoming season. So they'll actually overwinter in spaces that they are protected. And sometimes that may be our honeybee colonies. So when I flipped off that box, I was like, whoa, I like jumped back. But these guys aren't defensive because they are in this state. They have nothing to defend. They're more worried about their own life rather than the nest. So these guys just kind of took off. But they're very large comparatively. So if you ever look and study a paper wasp's nest for a little bit, you can eventually pick out the queen because she's going to be the largest of all those daughters that she's going to have. So if you ever see this in your apiary, just go ahead and brush them off because this will be the next generation of these paper wasp nests. And so a lot of the questions that I get are like, what's the difference between a yellow jacket and a hornet? So yellow jacket's a little bit smaller. And they nest underground. That's going to be the biggest difference. And they're highly aggressive, and they will scavenge off human food. So any kind of human resources they'll go out and find. The hornets are going to be larger. We have two native species of hornet. Pictured here is the bald-faced hornet, and the other one is going to be the European hornet, which looks very similar to the murder hornets that were big not too long ago. But the murder hornets have actually been eradicated from the United States officially. So our colonies can rest from this threat. And the hornets, they'll build this aerial paper nest that you'll see, and they're highly defensive. That means they won't really come after you unless you start to disturb their nest for any reason. And these guys won't necessarily scavenge off like dead carcasses or like even our food, but they actually prefer to actively hunt. So they prefer live prey.
Oh.
And these guys are great biocontrol methods as well. So they're help keeping this the population of pests under control as well. So like caterpillars and other things, they're keeping them under control so our plants can actually grow a little bit in crops. So that's kind of it with native non-bee pollinators. We can take a break here because then we're just going to get into more of the characteristics and actually the native bees. So yeah, we'll take like a quick 5-minute break, and then we can come back if that's cool.
Yeah, that works. Do you want to take questions now?
Yes, yeah. I would love to take questions. Yes.
Okay, I'll just answer the questions in the Q&A, but if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, we can. Well, actually, let's start with James.
Hey, got a question about the monarch butterfly. So you're saying they're putting up nets so where they have to fly over car and truck traffic. So does that mean that the monarch butterflies have a specific route they take when they go to Mexico?
Yeah, so like whenever they're heading south, they do have a specific route. I'm not gonna say like they're gonna follow like a certain path, like they're gonna fly directly home type of thing, but they are gonna head south, and more likely than not, they're gonna hit a highway at some point in time. And so they're playing around with the idea of playing with these large nets. I don't think they've established them yet. They are looking into them as a conservation effort. Just because the monarch butterfly population is so low. I'm not sure on the exact number, but I think like more than half of the population, when they do population surveys down in Mexico, they the population has declined over half over these past couple of years, and a lot of it is contributed to possible stress on their migratory path to Mexico down south.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the monarch and milkweeds. I've heard that there's a tropical milkweed that should not be planted in certain areas because it interferes with the migration pattern.
Oh yeah, I have not heard about that exactly, but I can assume because if it's a tropical milkweed, it's probably not native to this area, or at least like the migratory route of the monarch butterfly. So I'm not sure why they're saying not to plant it, but I'm sure it has something to do with it's not necessarily native, so it is disrupting this natural pattern. Maybe it's something in the nectar, or maybe it's too attractant, or like a certain alkaloid or chemical in the nectar that may be disrupting and it's not benefiting our monarchs at all. So I can't necessarily confirm or deny. That's just like my I'm sorry. I just haven't heard about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I had a resource from the Lady Bird Johnson Center about milkweeds that you should be planting to support monarchs. So that's a good start.
Yeah. I was gonna say I'm not the expert on this, but I know a little bit. It has more to do with the immature stages. So you want kind of breaks that basically viruses build up. And so you don't want more generations than should normally be happening with our native milkweed, if that makes sense.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, you need that natural break so maybe the viruses will dissipate and not continue on to the next generation.
Right, and that was more the tropical milkweed. They'd raise subsequent generations of caterpillars on them, and then you'd have these viral buildups, parasitoid buildups, everything like that, and you'd have some kind of persisting issues with the next normal wave.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Did James? Did you have another question? Or your hands are still raised. Cindy had a question. Oh, ski. Yeah, I'll always go ski. Go first.
Yeah, I just had a question on the bee flies. You mentioned that they had a long forward proboscis that they cannot retract. And I was wondering, how could evolution not have taken care of that in over all these years that they can't retract their tongue? That's kind of strange.
Yeah, maybe it's just not a detriment. I mean, it wasn't selected against to have this non-retractable thing. Maybe it provided more stability for the actual tongue to reach the actual nectar source of the flower. So maybe that was selected for. You know,
Seems
sometimes
like
evolution.
it'd be tough to fly around with that tongue hanging out.
I don't know. It might make you more aerodynamic. You got this thing sticking out in front of you.
There you go, rudder. Thank you.
Yes.
I had either a wasp or hornet attack some of my hives a couple years ago, and they completely wiped out the hive. And they were two of my more productive hives. Within a week or two, they literally ate everything: honey, brood, everything. What was going on?
So similar to like that, the murder hornet scare back in 2020. So yellow jackets and hornets kind of have the same behavior where they will attack a colony and then eventually decimate the worker colony. Ways to mitigate that, I would put barriers or over the entrances so the actual hornets and or yellow jackets can't make it into the hive. So like a mesh that the bees can get through, but the actual hornets and stuff can't. So they're so like I said, they're predatory. So they're actually getting the brood and the workers to actually feed to their brood, because they're carnivorous. And then the honey is just a benefit. That's what's like awesome nectar for them. So they're collecting. So they saw it as a large resource gain, and then so they went after it. If that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then with the yellow jackets or hornets, you know, I guess if you do have smaller colonies, they could potentially go into the colony. And so kind of like Keegan mentioned, you got to do an entrance reducer if your colonies are really small, or you can do some kind of mesh. I'm not sure exactly which size mesh you can use. But yeah, if your colonies are really small, then, you know, the wasp could go into the colony. But typically if they're strong enough, then it's not as much issue. So I really don't know what your colonies look like when that issue arose. Like, were they kind of dwindling and small, or were they actually large colonies? Hope you should be unmuted.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, these were very productive hives that had produced, I don't know, 30, 40 pounds of honey each year. And I probably did not have entrance reducers. I took them out because of the heat in the summer just to give more airflow. And they attacked the guard bees and then wiped us out.
Yeah, and that's one problem with Texas, right? It gets really warm, so you want your entrance reducers to be on during the middle of the summer. And so, like if this becomes an issue again, you can get like a mesh, and I'm not sure exactly which size. Maybe Keegan might know, but there's probably a certain mesh size you can use that the bees can get through, but the yellow jackets or wasps or hornets couldn't get through.
Yes, exactly.
I saw them on the hive box, and I was like, well, they're predators too. So they, you know, but then I didn't think they were going to be so aggressive to, you know, kill my. I mean, they completely wiped out the hives. So live and learn.
I've experienced that for sure in some areas of Texas. They're especially in the fall. They'll target weak colonies, but they can make a dent in stronger ones too. And it's usually southern yellow jackets. You'll find cut up bees on the bottom board. So.
Lauren, what do you typically do then?
Yeah, a lot of entrance reduction. I've used yellow jacket traps, but really you're kind of fighting a losing battle a lot of the time by that time of the year. Yeah, it's a struggle in some spots. So I have tried to find nests, which is about impossible because they're usually at least somewhat ground nesting. They'll even nest in soffit. The southern yellow jackets will, kind of like a bee removal expert, will find these guys, girls. And yeah, I tend to put traps out, especially in the fall. There's ones with pretty good lures. You can do various meat traps because they're more after protein at that point. And that's why they kill your colony so quickly. And yeah, just like y'all were saying, entrance reducers keep strong colonies, but the yellow jackets are smaller than a bee. So it's talk about like reduce them down to the smallest entrance if you've got them harassing a colony, and then just hit it with everything you got. Otherwise, it's a hard one. I mean, I've definitely had whole yards where it was an ongoing struggle, and then something like a possum or an armadillo would go and kick up a yellow jacket nest, and my problem was fixed. But
Oh, okay.
yeah. If you can find them, you can destroy them.
Yeah, maybe you need to start an armadillo farm.
I would love that.
I think Cindy had a question. I know she mentioned that she's wondering if your presentation would be available for her Master Gardener group, but maybe she had another question. Did we lose Cindy? Let's see, I don't see her. Okay, yeah, I don't see Cindy, but when she comes back, she can answer your question. But yeah, her major question was, it says, will your presentation be available for us to use in local speaker events we ourselves participate in?
Yes, yeah, it can be available.
Okay,
I think,
perfect.
like, did you send it out
Thank you.
already? Oh, okay, yeah. Did you send it out with the link or?
Yeah. So after this, we're recording this currently, and so we'll post everything on our YouTube page and then our Google Classroom. So we have all the recordings available. So if you're okay with us sharing it to Cindy, or if other groups want to use it, yeah, we can share it to anybody that wants to use it.
Okay,
Thank you
awesome.
so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
I didn't know. Yeah.
I think that's all the question. Oh yeah, so Lynn had a question. Yeah, I can help answer this too, and maybe Lauren can too. But any updates on yellow-legged hornets? And so, do you want to talk about them a little bit, and then I can maybe talk about what we're doing to address them?
Yes. So the risk is very similar to what Lee said about the hornets taking over colonies. That's the big risk right now. And then also kind of like going on what like Lee said, it's like it can wipe out a decimated colony. I don't know if y'all have seen, but there was a viral videos going around not too long ago of honeybees actually combating the Asian giant hornet in their colonies. And so that's Apis cerana. Apis cerana has this behavior where they will ball these wasps and then actually cook them alive, basically up to like where like the degree difference is 1 degree between the mortality temperature of the bees versus the wasps. It's like 1 degree difference. So they get right up to that point and then they stop. So the European honeybees don't have that behavior. And so that's why it was a big issue with the Asian giant hornet. And then also these hornets, they don't have necessarily the behavior to actually fend off these guys besides stinging. But when they come up against a big hornet, they're going to lose that battle 9 times out of 10. So as far as I know, there's still the first observation was in Georgia, and they're still kind of around that southern area. They haven't really made it, at least to my knowledge. Garrett can probably and Lauren can probably answer it better. I don't think they've made it very much further west because of the observation efforts and the control efforts.
Yeah, they've only been found in South Carolina and Georgia currently, but I know there's kind of this, I guess, southeastern wide wasp monitoring method, and so I don't think TAIS is on here, but yeah, they have sort of wasp traps across the state, and they're basically seeing like what's out there and whether yellow-legged hornets make it into Texas, and so we're hoping, and we kind of talked about this during the state meeting last fall, sort of our honeybee protection plan to add some more of this wasp monitoring because this wasp could be pretty detrimental to colonies in the state of Texas. So we want to kind of set them up in sort of high risk areas where they could be imported or make its way into Texas. And so we can have and potentially have a plan in place to take care of it. But currently we haven't seen any cases. But if you think you found a yellow-legged hornet, you can send us a picture or send us a vial to verify whether it is or not. And so I've had a few beekeepers in the Houston area that have sent me and the apiary inspector samples to verify whether it is a yellow-legged hornet or not. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. Maybe Keegan knows more about I guess the life cycle of them. I think we're still learning more about yellow-legged hornet, like where they live, where they nest, like how high up they nest, some of the behaviors.
Yeah, so we'll actually talk about this when we talk about sociality, but their life cycle is perennial. They don't have this ongoing thing, so they'll have this overwintering queen, kind of like what I showed with the other paper wasps. I'm not sure on the exact height of how far they nest up, but they do create this paper um, colony similar to what I showed with the bald-faced hornets. They have it more of like attached to the actual branch that they're on instead of it hanging down like the picture I showed. Um, but yeah, that's the life cycle. And these colonies can get upwards of like 6,000 individuals. So they can create fairly large colonies that can easily overwhelm a lot of colonies or honeybee colonies very quickly. And so that's like one of the bigger risks of these things. And so if you have a larger colony, the more resources you got to bring in to feed your brood and everything. So the more voracious they're actually going to be.
Yeah, and I have a extension publication from Clemson University, and so I'll attach that here and I'll put in the classroom just so you can read more about it if you're not familiar with it. And maybe we can have TAIS come in and give you an update about what they're doing about it. You know, obviously extension, we're working with them, but they're kind of the people that have their feet on the ground and really addressing some of these challenges that could get into Texas. And so yeah, let me start with maybe adding this publication, but maybe I'll have them come in and speak about it for 5 to 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I guess we can take a 5-minute break. Okay, perfect. I think we'll come back at 9:50. Does that work for you, Keegan?
Yes, that's awesome.
Yeah, perfect.
Camera on. So otherwise, people leave their camera on because they just there and they leave and they come back and they look out the window and stuff. Like, just turn your camera off. You hear that question I asked?
I couldn't really hear what you were asking. I did hear you.
I attached this extension publication about it if you want more information. But it does have some really good pictures and descriptions of them and how they differ from other, hornets. So yeah, this is the yellow-legged hornet and how it differs from like a European hornet and the Asian giant hornet. Also, like the facial differences between them. But yeah, I think Lee's the one that asked the question, but they have different preventative methods on here. So like an anti-robbing screen. They also have, I've never used this before, this Apis Shield Hornet trap. So I've never used it before, but it could be a good option. So has anybody else used this, like a Hornet trap like this before? Maybe not. Yeah, so maybe leave that. That might be a good option. Oh, I can't hear you. Yeah, so Lee asked, what does a Hornet trap look like and where do you get it? Yeah, let me share the screen again. It's in this link that I put in the chat. Yeah, this is what the Hornet trap looks like from Vita Bee Health. So I'd assume that you could get this at most bee supply stores. I haven't looked, and so maybe you can look it up quick. But it says hive-mounted trap used for both trapping and exclusion to manage hornets and Langstroth colonies. Yeah, so you basically put in the front entrance, and it has sort of this kind of entrance reducer. So, but once again, with any type of entrance reducer, I mean the heat in Texas makes this a bit more difficult. So, if you have a pretty well ventilated colony, maybe you have a screen bottom board or more supers, this could be a good option. But I guess I'd be really careful. And I guess I'd assume that you'd probably be using this, later in the fall when we're kind of past that heat spell. But you never know here in Texas, so it's kind of worth a shot in case you start having some issues. But yeah, let me look if there's anything on the bee supply stores. Okay, so yeah, so Don Johnson said they're easy to make, but Manlick has them. And then Sarah Fleener says we use rubber screen / mouse guards on our hives. The bees have to walk down to get into the hive, leaving a bigger hallway, giving the guard bees better opportunities to defend. Yeah, I think that'd be a good option. I mean, some of these are smaller, but I think with the yellow-legged hornet, I believe they're a little bit bigger, and so this might work better for the yellow-legged hornet versus maybe other wasps. Okay, Keegan. I'll let you jump in, and I'll answer any questions in the chat if you have them.
Okay, yeah, and if anything's like unclear in the moment, and like, just feel free to like rate and just jump in, or if anything comes up. All right. Share that. Well, that sucks. All right, we'll go all the way back down to everything we just saw. All right, and now we'll finally get into native bees and their biology. So we'll jump in first. We talked a little bit about the order Hymenoptera when we talked about wasps and hornets. So that includes bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. They first arose in the Triassic period, and then one of the main characteristics that they have mandibles for chewing. So this helps our honeybees chew wax, and then wasps hunt, and then as well as ants gather, and also like sting us. And then the big characteristics that you'll see is the constricted waist, which is sometimes known as the wasp waist. And this is the constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. They have 2 pairs of membranous wings compared to like our pollinating flies that only had that 1 pair of wings. And this is also how they get their name, Hymenoptera. They have complete metamorphosis. So this means they go from egg, larva to pupa, all the way to adult. If an insect were to have incomplete metamorphosis, that means they go from egg and they go into the nymph stage, which just looks like a smaller version of the adult, sometimes without wings and immature sexual organs. And they have a modified ovipositor, which is our favorite. This means that they can actually sting us compared to other insects that have the ability to like just lay eggs out of their ovipositor. So rare within the order Hymenoptera is actually social behavior. A lot of the most famous hymenopterans like ants, bees, and wasps are known from their social species, but actually a large majority of this order is actually solitary or a different range of sociality. An extremely rare characteristics is honey production. Really only honeybees produce the true honey. Bumblebees produce a honey-like substance, as well as stingless bees. They produce like another type of honey that's a little bit more watery compared to the honey that we collect. So basic bee anatomy, we have the antenna, ocelli, which are the simple eyes. This is what is the light detecting organs for hymenopterans. So this is what enables bees to have navigation as well, and this allows them to not be able to fly at night. And also you can see up here, so males have an additional abdominal segment. They also have an additional segment of the antenna. So usually males will have longer antenna, and males will also have, usually on their labium, they'll have a bright yellow spot. Another and then so the other distinguishing characteristics, we have these branched hairs, which allows them to better efficiently pick up pollen, and actually creates an electromagnetic field, which actually like sucks the pollen to them even better. Some bee families have longer tongues than others. Some have shorter tongues. And the biggest things right here is the pollen carrying hairs, which is called scopa. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but not all bees have scopa. They have corbiculums as we get into the family Apidae. But all the other families of bees have this these extended branched pollen carrying hairs called scopa. Now, bee morphology is extremely diverse. We get all the way up into the smallest bee, all the way up to the largest bee, which is our carpenter bees, and we have different forms with our abdomen, thorax, and heads. And these differentiate between the different families of bees themselves. And then right smack dab in the middle, we have our honeybees, which are right in between small and medium. And so this is why they're able to be such a good generalist pollinator. And so what's really interesting is that their sociality on a spectrum pretty much. You go from the left-hand side, which is solitary. This means that the bee does, or the female does everything herself. That means she's finding the nest, she's establishing, she's possibly excavating the cavity that she's going to build, or the tunnel in the ground. And she's going to go out and collect all the nectar and pollen that she needs to create her pollen provision for the next generation. And with solitary bees, they do not live to see their offspring. It's a seasonality, or if there is a multi-generational time span within that same year, more likely than not, that the founding female or the mother will die before the next generation hatches. But a lot of these bees can then go back and forth on the spectrum, where they can go into communal, which means that they share a common entrance. Each mother is still caring for her individual young, and she'll have her individual unit within that common entrance, but there is that they all share a common entrance into that different nest. There's quasi-social, which is, it can be temporary. That means when the next generation, so all these generations of bees are hatching at once, they might share that nest for a period of time. So there might be a dominant female, which then kind of takes over the nest for a certain amount of time. She begins to prepare, and she begins to prepare the tunnels and units for her own offspring and begins to lay, while some of the others will then go out and forage and or defend the common entrance. Then also with semi and subsocial, it's a fluid division of labor. There's multiple generations that live within this same nest as well. So it's very similar to quasi-social, where it's temporary, where they have this division of labor, but eventually these individual females will then go out and find their own nest and lay their own youngs, or offspring, sorry. And then we get into like primitively eusocial. It's eusocial, all the characteristics, overlapping generation, division of brood care, and reproductive casts, but it's an annual colony. That means it does not last throughout the year, and it does not last throughout the summer. Every year, the colony eventually disintegrates and shuts down, and then only the next generation of the queen will overwinter in another cavity or another area. And then when the spring rolls around, then she'll go out and find her own cavity to begin her next generation, the next colony. And then we have truly eusocial. That's our honeybees. This is also like ants and termites throughout termites. They are truly eusocial, but not in the terms of hymenopterans. They're perennial. That means they last throughout the year, and they're multi-years. That means they can last, if in the right areas, they can last from year to year to year. And so just focusing on honeybees before we actually start getting into native bees. Honeybees are non-native. They were introduced by the European settlers back in the 1500s. They're native to Europe, Western Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. They are truly eusocial. They have this perennial colony. They are corbiculum bees, so they have this corbicular structure on their hind legs. They're generous pollinators. They can pollinate a lot of different flowers. They're heavily managed, and they're the only species of bee to have hairy eyes, which is quite interesting. So what is a native bee? It's just simply a bee that co-evolved within its local ecosystem. It evolved with all the abiotic and biotic stressors, all the local flora and fauna that may put pressure on them going into that coevolution that we talked about in the last presentation. So they are perfectly adapted to the environment that they find themselves in and the flowers that they have been pollinating for millions of years. And these guys come, and as a result of that, these guys come in every shape and size. There's over 20,000 species worldwide. Around 4,000 are native to North America, and 800 plus, there's been a recent development where there could be even upwards of 1,500 different species in Texas alone. And and pictured here is the largest species of bee in North America, the California carpenter bee, and the smallest, which is the fairy bee. So we can divide these guys, not so much by family, but by three broad groups. You can have cavity nesters. That means they can either create or find their own little tunnel system to create their pollen provision. As you can see, our little bee up here at the top has created her pollen provision and laying that egg on top of it. 25% of these guys of all native bees are cavity nesting, and they're mostly solitary. But a large majority of native bees are ground nesting. That means they're going to create tunnels into the ground, down into it, and have their own cavities and their own tunnels in there with the pollen provision and eggs. Most of those ground nesting bees are solitary but can form aggregates. That means that it's not communal, so they're not sharing that common interest or common entrance of the nest, but rather they nest all in the same patch of dirt or soil that is exposed. And so they're all nesting around each other, but there's no division of labor. No one's helping out each other. They just live near each other. And then finally, we have cuckoo bees. These guys are kleptoparasites. They lay eggs in others' nests. So they'll actually wait until another solitary bee has left their cavity to go out and forage, possibly. They'll then enter that nest, eat the egg, and then lay their own egg on top of it. And so these guys are purely letting everybody else do the work. And they're not great pollinators too. As you can see, this bee that is pictured here doesn't really have a lot of scopa on her body, so they're going to be more indirect pollinators than actual pollinators. And also these guys can be oligolectic. That means they can be narrow, specialized preferences for pollen sources. And it's hypothesized this arose through limitation of bee learning or ability, or larva inability to digest other pollen sources. So this leads to that specialization of pollen, possibly through different co-evolutionary relationships. And this specialized relationship can sometimes be just a single flower or family of flowers, or in the really extreme cases, just a single species of flower, where these different bee morphologies or flower morphologies have become so specialized that only the bee can pollinate that flower and only that bee can collect pollen from that flower. Or you can be polylectic. It means you're a generalist pollinator, that you're just going out and you're like, hey, if I can pollinate it, I'm getting pollen from it. And so the solitary life cycle I talked about a little bit earlier. We have the foundress, or the first queen or reproductive female. She'll build the nest and then lay her egg on top of the pollen provision that's which she's collected. Will hatch to become a larva, then eat that pollen provision throughout her developmental life cycle, and then pupate, become an adult, and then begin the life cycle all over again by foraging, collecting pollen, and eventually building a nest. And it's also important to note here, before we move on, is that all hymenopterans still have the haplodiploidy reproductive system. So all these guys, so all males are still going to be haploid, and all the females are still going to be diploid. And then this is the determination system between all hymenopterans. And another very interesting thing with the solitary life cycle, so solitary bees will begin to lay the females first when they establish a nest. And then as that cavity becomes closer and closer to the entrance, then she'll lay the males. This may be due to that the pollen sources are becoming more limited. And so there's a small in pollen provision. And so she'll lay a haploid egg on top of that, because males are usually smaller than the females anyway within a given species. Yeah, so that's why. And then so they'll emerge first, these male eggs, and then they'll actually wait outside these nests, possibly in an aggregate, and wait for the females to begin to emerge, and then they'll go off and try to mate with them. So now we'll get into the diversity of native bees themselves, which is quite broad. So we have 7 different families. There's a few that we won't talk about today. We'll only talk about the ones that are found mostly in North America. So we won't talk about Stenotrinidae, which is only found in Australia. So that's a really interesting family of bee that's like really not a lot have been known about. And there's only 21 species of this family, so that's also why it's extremely rare. But we'll go through and talk about all these different guys and how distinguishing characteristics, so everybody can tell them apart in the different life cycles. So we'll start with minor bees. Sorry, there's like a beeping in my ear, so I don't know what that was. Oh, man, I'm super sorry, guys. I don't know what just happened. Resume. Okay, cool. We're back. And where are my notes? Okay, sweet. Okay, so sorry about that, guys. So we'll start off with minor bees, which is the Adrenidae family. They get their name because they're pretty much all ground nesting. They're solitary. They commonly form aggregates. That mean they're all gonna nest in the same location. forming bee cities, as they're colloquially called. Most of these guys are unable to sting. If they are able to sting, it's very mild, and they're most active at temperate temperatures. This family also contains one of the four who have that are active at dawn and dusk. So like when it's really dark outside, how I mentioned earlier that they don't have this ability to really fly during nighttime because there's no sun to help the location. But some species have evolved to actually come out when it's darker, possibly to pollinate some of the flowers that produce their nectar and are white and broad and broadcast themselves at night. And these guys are oligolectic, means they're more specialized into different families. Most of these guys prefer flowers within the family Solanaceae. And this is a pretty large family of bee. It has over 1,300 species. And yes. And so this is what a minor bee nest might look like. You might see a little mound on top of the earth with all these holes going down into it. And then as you can see, she can have her different compartments, each with a young larva with a pollen provision and with possibly multiple development stages existing within this single colony. So as Slater mentioned, I threw this in super quickly. The new bee that was just discovered not too long ago up in Oklahoma and northern Texas is Andrena androphobia. So this is a minor bee. It's got its name because of the male pictured here. And as you can see, this the yellow clypeus that I was talking about a little earlier, compared to the female, which doesn't have this yellow clypeus. It gets its name from the fovea, which is pictured here. Males of bees don't really have this fovea. Rather, so that's how it got its name. It was like the only male that's been discovered that has a fovea or has these hairs along the fovea, I mean. But yeah, so that's a super interesting find. It was founded by James Hung up in Oklahoma. We actually, a past lab member of the Rangel lab actually is under him now as a graduate student. So he was a part of this discovery, which is pretty cool. Moving on to the next family, which is the cellophane bees or Coletidae. These guys are also ground nesters. They get their name because they line their nest with a waterproof secretion from their DeForest gland. So they almost create like a Ziploc bag for their young to help protect against any fungus or bacteria that is found in the soil. And so these cell wall secretions has linalool, which is secreted from the gland in the bee's mandible, which also protects against bacteria and fungus. And they seal the eggs against or to the wall of the actual of the cavity themselves. So they're also not exposed to as much moisture. Like most ground nesters, they are solitary and commonly form aggregates, and they can be generalist, and some species can be specialist pollinators as well. And so this is the secretions that I was talking about, how they get their name. It's just like, it almost looks like they're wrapped in plastic. As you can see, our little cellophane bee here holding her plastic bag, getting ready to lay some eggs in. Yeah, so it's really interesting. And when you touch it, it almost feels like plastic as well. So moving on, we have our sweat or furrow bee or Halictidae. One of the main characteristics of this family is this jaw, how sharp their jaw is right here. So this is a good way to tell if you're dealing with a sweat bee or not. This is the second largest family of bees. Most are ground nestings, but some are cavity nesters. They have a wide variety of sociality within this. They can also be primitively eusocial. It's one of the only other families besides Apidae that has primitively eusocial behavior or sociality, I mean. It is hypothesized to think that this might have some environmental influence to determine if eusociality is exhibited in species or if they have this spectrum of sociality. It may be in times when resources are tough, it's better if one female stays behind and focuses on reproduction, and some focus on cooperative brood care, while others go out and actually forage for these resources to bring back. And they get their name sweat bees because they're actually attracted to sweat. We'll see a video a little bit later about how they get their name. Just like honeybees, they're attracted to dirty water. And so sweat is a great resource as it's filled with all the vitamins that they would want. And these guys are also great pollinators of squash, legumes, sunflowers, watermelons, apples, berries, carrots, tomatoes, and peppers. So a cool genus within sweat bees is the tiny sweat bee. It's the largest bee genus with over 1,800 species. These guys are ground nesters. Some do it, and some establish their nest in rotten logs. Some are also solitary nesting and also have that primitively eusociality. And some species are also social parasites. Most are generalist pollinators, and a real advantage of these guys is that they can pollinate almost everything. Because of their small size, these really small flowers are available to them to actually pollinate. And so this is the actual size of these guys. This is a picture of a small sweat bee on somebody's finger. Probably the prettiest of all bees is the green sweat bee. You guys have probably seen these guys flying around your garden. They look like flying jewels almost. There's a couple different genuses within the tribe Ogoclarini, but like most sweat bees, they're ground nesters, they're solitary, and can form aggregates with cooperative behavior. And most are generalist pollinators. And so here's this video that I was talking about. You can see one of these green sweat bees actually trying to pick up a lot of the sweat through my pants here. I was out in the Indiana Dunes State Park, and we were collecting for these native bees. And when we were taking a break on a hot day, one actually landed on me and tried to collect as much sweat as they could. And so a lot of times when people say that, oh, I just got bit by like a fly or something like that, it may have been a sweat bee trying to get at your sweat. You swat at them, and then they kind of get you a little bit. They sting you. So moving on to the next family, we have leafcutter bees. This is Megachilidae. What's really sets them apart is their scopa is on the underside of their abdomen. It's not on the back legs or the legs of the bee themselves. It's on the underside, so you can recognize these guys by their really yellow butt. They also have these really large mandibles, which are used to cut leaves, as their name suggests, or collect other nesting material. So these guys are cavity nesters. The leafcutter bee lines with leaves. There are other species as well that have other nest construction materials. They're solitary. There's actually some managed species of these guys, especially the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, which has become very popular pollinating species, as well as the blue orchard mason bee. And these guys range from generalists to specialist pollinators. So this is what the leafcutter bee nesting kind of looks like. They nest. You may have these bee homes in your own garden, where it's mostly for these leafcutter bees. Well, they'll cut out semicircles of different plants. And so if you have this damage in your garden, you know you have leafcutter bees around, and then they'll create their pollen packets within that. And then actually when they emerge, they kind of emerge like a little bee burritos, and they'll come out of this all wrapped up in leaves. Another really important genus within this is the mason bees, or Osmia. They're cavity nesters, and they line their nests with mud or dirt. There's some others that use resin and even pebbles to line their nests. These guys are solitary and generalist pollinators, and these guys are really good in, like the name suggests, like orchards and other things like that. So mason bee masonry, you can see here, she's out there gathering mud to eventually line her nests with. And then down here, we have all the different nests. So we have here the Megachilidae genus, which are the leafcutter bees. So you can see how it's lined with all this cut up leaves. Resin bees, which use resin in the genus Herades. And that's how she separates the different larva cells. And then finally, the mason bee, which you can see all the different provisions lined with mud. Finally, we get into the largest family, which is our Apidae bees. This is over 5,700 species of bees, which includes anything from like orchid bees, pictured here, all the way to digger bees. This includes the subfamily Apinae, which is the corbiculate bees. And you can see pictured there, the actual corbiculum on the back femur, which allows them to carry these large pollen packets on their legs. The first stuff our first families or genuses that we're going to talk about are the large and small carpenter bee. So the large carpenter bees are going to be pictured here. They have this characteristic large bald spot on their thorax, which helps sets them apart from bumblebees in your garden. They're cavity nesters, and they actually drill their own cavities. So these guys will drill into like pithy stemmed plants or the hardwood. A lot of people consider them pests because people don't want them burrowing into their houses. They're solitary generalist pollinators, and they actually forage and store food for the adults. So they'll forage and store food for later, which is actually one of the only times this arises, like compared to all the other bee species that we talk about. When they gather these food, it's for their young. These guys are also nectar robbers. So they're kind of hijacking the pollination system. They'll cut into the side of the flowers themselves and then steal the nectar through there without actually coming in contact with any of the pollen. These guys are also great pollinators of tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. And these crops cannot be pollinated by honeybees themselves because of the specific behavior that these guys exhibit. I don't know if we have any TU fans here, but this is your bee. It's the longhorn bee. As you can see here by their long antenna, and this is a male because of this bright yellow clypeus. It's the most diverse tribe with over 32 genera. Some are solitary, some form aggregates. Generalist to specialist pollinators between different species. And then males have these bright faces. And then those cute bee pictures that you see online all the time of bees sleeping together is these bees that form aggregations, and they sleep together in these different flowers. And you can see also the long scopa on the back legs of these bees. Within that is also the sunflower bee, Epimulisodes. This is a big bee genus that is specific in pollinating sunflowers. It's a type of longhorn bee. It often requires sunflower pollen, which is in the family Asteraceae. These guys are solitary to generalist pollinators as well. Specialist pollinators. And you can see on these different sunflowers and different asters, them collecting the pollen and how bright yellow their scopa is. The digger bee creates this super cool nest structure. This is actually the excavant of their nest cavity. These are called tumuli, with these tunnels coming off of their actual cavity. These guys have been characterized as boisterous flying and defense. Many entomologists have said that when they go out and collect digger bees, all they need to do is wave their net around, and they've collected 15 females already because they are pretty defensive of their nests. Their sting aren't as painful as honeybees, but still, that doesn't feel great. But yeah, you can always tell when a digger bee is around. They're ground nesting, and they're specialist pollinators, and they're also long tongued. So this means that they can reach that deeper tubed flowers. As we get into bumblebees, the only genus is Bombus. So there's 8 species found in Texas. They're primitively eusocial with a few hundred workers. Sadly, a lot of these guys are in decline. This is like the poster child of bee conservation, especially like Bombus affinis. They also have to find pre-existing cavities to it. So they don't excavate their own holes or anything like that. They have to find, many times it might be rodent holes or small divots, or it might be nesting in long grass. That's how they establish their nests. And these guys are also great pollinators of squash, legumes, sunflowers, watermelons, apples, berries, carrots, tomatoes, and peppers. So this is the bumblebee colony life cycle. In the winter, we have an overwintering queen, pictured over here. As we get into spring, she goes out and collects a lot of resources. She starts collecting pollen and nectar. And so that way she is able to, when she does actually find a suitable cavity, whether that be in a log or underneath a rock, or like we were talking about earlier, like a rodent burrow, she'll start to make her cups of comb, which is pictured down here, kind of looks almost like popcorn. And then finally, once her first generation of workers hatch and emerge, they will take over the division of labor. They'll go out and forage and collect resources for the colony, while the queen stays behind and lays eggs. And then as we get more into late summer and fall, she'll actually start to lay drones and subsequent queens for the next year. Sadly, eventually, the workers will eventually kill the founding queen because they begin to take over. They believe they can then reproduce, but they actually can't because they're not mated. So eventually that leads to the collapse of the colony, but they'll kill the queen before winter hits. All the virgin queens will then go out and mate and then find a place to overwinter, and the cycle begins again. And this is, so the cuckoo bees, it's found in 3 different families, so Apidae, Megachilidae, and Halictidae. These guys are kleptoparasitic. That means that they're going to go find colony or tunnels in other nests to lay their own eggs in. They're solitary, and they lack scopa. And so they're found in 3 different families, and a lot of the times the kleptoparasite will actually become specialists to their same family. So Apidae cuckoo bees will then prey on Apidae species. So pictured here is actually a kleptoparasitic bumblebee. And so she will infiltrate a colony and begin to lay her own eggs within that colony. So now we'll get into more of the importance of pollinator diversity. It is important to have a lot of different pollinators because of the different flower morphology that we were talking about. So these flowers depend on a multitude of different species, for example, to come and pollinate them because of the different behavior and morphologies that they show. And some of these flowers have evolved specialist relationships with different bees and different pollinators because of that co-evolution that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Some may have deeper nectar producing structures compared to others, and others have different ways that their pollen has to be distributed. And so it's important that we have this large variety because not every flower can be pollinated by honeybees, and not every flower can get pollinated by honeybees. So the pollinator guild diversity, a guild is a group of species that use the same resource in a similar way. So it's necessary for pollination of all plants. Some bees fly at different heights than others, and others are more ground flying. Some are higher up in the trees, and it all depends on the preference and the biology of these bees themselves. And so this determines if you have like a tree and orchard, some of the lower flowers might not get pollinated because of the behavior of whatever bees are in the area, while the same thing might happen at the top of the trees. That's why you need to have these different varieties of pollinators so that all flowers in a possible area can get pollinated. And then also some bees may be active more early in the morning when these flowers produce more nectar or release more pollen, or at night, so that you need like species that are more active during the morning, evening, and during the afternoon. And agricultural systems, kind of like I was talking about with the orchards, with a diversity of pollinators within in that area, exhibit higher yields compared to orchards or agricultural places that only have one source of pollinators. This also has to act within temporally. So some species of native bees will be more active in the year themselves, so they may be more early emerging than others that may emerge a little bit later, such as in the summer or fall. And so you need to have these, like, you're basically trying to just cover all your bases, and this is what this diversity allows. And then going into the foraging behavior as well, as I mentioned, not all bees can do this. So mostly the larger bees are only able to exhibit buzz pollination. And this is when a bee will grab an anther, decouple their wing muscles, and literally shake the anther of that pollen, of that flower, I mean. So bumblebees are really good at this, carpenter bees, some of the digger bees as well. So honeybees do not do this either. And kind of going into this as well, honeybees, when used in alfalfa production, alfalfa flowers, you have to actually trip the pollen source. And this is when they have a landing pad. The bee will have to land there, and then that trips and kind of springs out the anthers. Honeybees have gotten to the point where they're like, dude, I don't want to do this. I don't like getting smacked in the face. And so they actually won't visit some alfalfa flowers once they learn they're going to get smacked. But the alfalfa leafcutter bee, as we were talking about earlier in the Megachilidae family, they're a little bit more robust and are better at taking that first smack of the anther. And so they're able to pollinate alfalfa a little bit more efficiently than honeybees by comparison. So the foraging behavior also is influenced by the size. So smaller bees can't fly as far, while larger bees can fly further. And so this contributes to, this contributes a little bit later when we talk about habitat fragmentation. When you have these smaller bees, they can't fly as far as some of these larger bees to collect the same amount of resources necessary. I know we were talking a lot about honeybee versus native bees, but these guys actually work really well together if there's a lot of resources. Honeybees will actually modify their behavior in the presence of other native bees. So honeybees are actually incredibly competitive. These guys are the Michael Jordan of the bee world. When they know there's competition around, they'll actually become more efficient pollinators. They'll visit more flowers, and they'll actually cross-pollinate better when they know other native bees are around. This was done by Britton et al. In 2013 in an orchard. They compared orchards that only had native pollinators, only had honeybees, and ones with both. They found that orchards with both native bees and honeybees actually had higher fruit yields. And this is because the honeybees, when they were just by themselves in an orchard, they would only go down the row of the flowers and not cross-pollinate between male and female flowers. So no reproduction was actually happening. But when native bees were in the picture, this cross-pollination began to happen. They began to go, and they became a lot more efficient pollinators, collecting pollen from every flower rather than just being selective. But our native bees are extremely at risk. Kopek and Bird in 2017 did a comprehensive study of all 4,300 North American and Hawaiian native bee species. And due to the lack of research done, over 92% of them, they deemed like, hey, there's not enough information available to actually give them a conservation status. But of the 7.3 that were able to it, over half of them are vulnerable to extinction. And these are due to factors such as habitat fragmentation, exposure to pesticides and other chemicals, exposure to pollutants. Pollutants are important because they may cover up floral scent that the bees rely on to forage efficiently. Then also climate change. It affects different flower traits such as nectar production and when the flowers actually bloom themselves. And this is one of the main things that are happening. As it warms up earlier, the bees may emerge sooner than the flowers bloom. So when the bees emerge, there's no flowers for them to forage on, and they'll perish. And then when the flowers do finally emerge, either these bees aren't around or they've had a specialist relationship with a certain bee, and they're not able to get pollinated by that bee because either it emerged too early or it emerged too late to actually catch the peak bloom time of the certain bee species. And we'll talk a little bit more about each one. So the pesticide effects. So it can have off-target effects no matter what you're spraying. It could target a certain agricultural pest, but any kind of toxin in a system is going to have off-target effects, whether it may be sublethal doses. And these sublethal doses can cause cognitive decline, so they become less of an efficient forager. They may forget where the resource was, or how to find it, or which one was actually the best one. So they might not be able to get back to their nest home site as well. So their navigation's thrown off as well. And then also with pesticides, if you do not spray them in your garden or agricultural spaces, there's more beneficial predators to actually clean up those pests. So like we were saying, like the wasps and the fly larvae and other non-pollinating species can exist within these spaces, therefore taking care of the ecosystem themselves. And with habitat fragmentation, as we continue to develop a lot of the land, these habitats are becoming further and further fragmented, which will then affect some of the smaller species, especially because they're not able to forage longer distances to actually collect these resources and backs. It also limits viable nesting habitats, such as exposed earth or these logs and stems, which some of these cavity nesting bees depend on. And then also, like when you develop the land, there's not as great resource availability, limiting the amount of flowers in that certain area. So how do we support both? We simply reject tradition, stop mowing, stop doing pesticides, and embrace degeneracy. My dad hates this slide. He loves a well-manicured lawn, but eventually I'm working on him. I'm trying to get him to have like a native bee or a native garden in the backyard instead of this well-manicured lawn. And besides, I think the bottom picture looks a lot more inviting and pretty compared to the top. One of the main things is plant native plants. Like going back to the co-evolution, they evolved with these native bees, so they provide all the necessary nutrients that these bees need and at the certain times that they need. And then also they're better adapted for the soil in this area, climate as well. And so especially here in Texas, when we have these long droughts, we want plants that can persist through these hard times. And then plus also longer lasting flowers provide resources for longer. Exactly how it sounds. And one of the great resources is the Pollinator Partnership. They have this great thing. They have pollinator plant guides. You can actually input your zip code into this website, and it'll give you a guide that provides a lot of information, such as which plants, when do they bloom, what do they need sun or shade, what kind of moisture do they need, and then also what kind of pollinators does it attract. So does it attract butterflies, bees, or birds? An interesting fun fact: if it's more of a red flower, depending on the nectar guides and UV coloration, but based on red alone, bees cannot actually see red, so they're not actually looking at that color. So it's going to be more attractant to butterflies and bees. All right, butterflies and birds, I mean. But this is also a great resource. It also provides information on which kind of bees in your area and how to provide habitat for them as well. So I highly recommend the Pollinator Partnership guides. Another good thing is like, hey, there's weeds. These are the first flowers that are usually available first time in the spring. They're actually wildflowers themselves. This includes like dandelion, wild violet, henbit, and chickweed. So these guys are pretty native, even though they might not look as pretty or they're considered weeds. These guys are the first meal for emerging pollinators early in the year. And then native grasses as well. I know Bermuda is a great grass, but it's a pain to take care of. These guys, so native grasses actually have 10-fold longer roots than a lot of the imported and ornamental grasses. So this prevents erosion of the soil itself. They're drought tolerant and provide habitat for overwintering queens of bumblebees and other solitary bees as well. And then, of course, you can provide the bee homes, the cavity nesting habitats. Make sure to have a bunch of different sized holes before the different nesting habitats and the different size cavity nesters that may be in your garden, because they're going to choose the correct size hole. They don't want it too big, and they also don't want it too small, because they have to be able to fit in and fit out, right? And then another one is leave bare soil. So mulch and other coverages are actually like concrete for a lot of native bees. There's a negative correlation between how much mulch area and number of bee species in an area, according to Quistberg et al. In 2016. So some alternatives that you might be able to use is like use shredded leaves or compost. It's going to be better for your garden anyway, because it's going to provide that extra nutrients. If you do want to mulch anyway, leave the soil exposed in the back. And so that way there's still this provided resource for these native ground nesting bees. And something directly that we can do is treat for Varroa. Studies in 2023 showed that at least one honeybee-associated viruses was found in 53% of native bee and wasps that were tested. And this includes also like bacterial diseases. So like chalk brood was one of the big ones that was found, and European foul brood. So when we treat for Varroa, there's actually a less of a virus spillover in native species. And this was found with apiaries. When apiaries actually treated for Varroa mites, the surrounding area in the ecosystem, pollinators themselves, were actually healthier compared to apiaries that did not treat for Varroa. And this is pretty interesting. So not only are we taking care of our own honeybee colonies, but we're also directly taking care of the native pollinators in our area. And this spillover may happen from visiting the same flowers where Varroa mite or virus or the virus might be spread through the fecal oral route or something like that. So this is important to not only contribute to our own populations, but help out our native bees as well. So the big summary slide of all this things that we can do to take care of both populations is provide habitat for them, available habitat that they're able to access of multiple different kinds, whether that be exposed soil or shrubs with pithy stemmed for nesting, or the nest block themselves provide native flowering, which offer throughout the season. And yes, and also like a lot of the trees that can provide pollen and nectar for pollinators. So this is where a lot of my information and knowledge has come from throughout the years. Pollinator resources, iNaturalist, is something that y'all can join yourselves. You can directly contribute to a lot of biodiversity sources. They use the citizen science app to collect identifications throughout the areas and then also monitor populations. So all you have to do is download the app. You'll take a picture of whatever bee or pollinator or whatever else you want to look at. They also identify plants and all organisms. But yeah, all you do is take a picture of that, and then it will offer an identification, and then you can submit that, and it'll contribute to observational data. The Xerces Society is the conservation society for invertebrates. It works with other groups to track endangered species. They also have the Pollinator Resource Center and the Be Better Certified Seal. So if you see that, you know, they're partnering with the Xerces Society and helping contribute to pollinator conservation. The Pollinator Partnership, as I mentioned before, great resource. And the big one, if you want to learn more about native bees, more about the specific species and biology of these guys, is the Bees in Yours Backyard. It's a great resource. It has identification guides as well. And it covers all the different species in North America. It's honestly a great resource. And then a lot of the pictures that I showed today were from wildbeestexas.com. They're based out of the Rio Grande Valley. but they still have a great resource on all the different genera of native bees themselves. And so I highly recommend that as well if you want to dig deeper into this and possibly present in your own clubs. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to say thank you to Garrett Slater for inviting me along to this. I really enjoyed talking to y'all. And then another really fun fact is the world's largest bee is Wallace's giant bee. It's a leafcutter bee found in Indonesia. They actually have a really unique life cycle. They nest within termite colonies. They'll actually create their own little cavity within the nest. And that's how they also get protection for their own young. But yeah, these guys are also super endangered, and you can see the size comparison to the honeybee themselves. But yeah, that's it, guys. I appreciate you guys listening to me for so long. And yeah, I can take any questions y'all want or have.
Perfect. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, fantastic presentation. So we have a few questions, but if you have one that you haven't put into the chat, just raise your hands. And so Lee had a question about how deep some of these bees go into the ground. Like how deep do some of the, I guess, the ground dwelling bees go?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on obviously like the species. Every species is going to have its own depth. Some can go up to a foot deep. Some can go even further up into like 3-4 feet deep. And they're going to have like sprawling. They're kind of like, yeah, they're going to have like sprawling different cavities as that picture kind of thing. You're going to have the central entrance, and then it's going to go into multiple different tunnels, each with its own provision and young.
Yeah, and that probably depends on the soil conditions, right? Like the type of soil. I'd imagine like sandy versus clay soil. There'd be differences in like the ground dwelling nests.
Yes, yeah, and so they're able to like stabilize some of the tunnels through their salival secretions, and so that creates like a little bit more stability. And it's obviously going to depend on the area as well. So like some of these native bees that are really good, so like sandy. I can't think of a bee off the top of my head, but I know there's like some wasps that burrow down into more sandy soil. But yes, it's definitely more like a loam. It's like that's going to be more structured. Mm-hmm.
Well, perfect. And then Autumn had a question about, and I guess you sort of answered this, but are bumblebee species in decline due to rising temperatures? You know, so we think about like these endangered bumblebee species. Like, is it with the rising temperatures or pesticides, or do we really know?
We don't really know. So that's the big thing. It's probably a synergist of all these different factors, especially habitat fragmentation and habitat decline. Honestly, that's like the biggest one. It's like you not only destroy a lot of the viable nesting sites of these bees, but you're also destroying a lot of like the floral resources that are available. So the rusty patch bumblebee is like that's the big poster child for bumblebee decline as well. But there's also some others out in California. That one, they don't really know why that one is declining. It's the synergy of all these different factors of habitat destruction and floral resources decline, and then also competition with a lot of these other, whether it be honeybees or even other introduced native species in that area that are out competing this bumblebee.
You have to get back to like competition. So I guess I've heard like kind of mixed things between like how honeybees are impacting, you know, some of the native pollinators. And so like is competition really the biggest issue? So if you set like 50 colonies in 1 yard, like is that affecting the native bees, or is it more like the spread of these viruses and like chalkroot? I know chalkroot's a big issue for some of these native pollinators. Like how big of an issue is it for honeybees for some of these native pollinators, especially in like cities where like there's a lot of beekeepers and they're densely populated? You know, is that concern for some people?
It's definitely of concern. A lot of the papers that I've seen, that's like the higher the density of honeybees, the less native pollinators there are. But that goes back to they're just going on abundance. They're not going on like what's actually causing the decline. Is this the competition? And so I think a lot of people have now, or there's a lot of studies that have shown it's like, oh, it's the competition side of it because they're more abundant, but it's like the viral work and the spillover, is that contributing also to this, you know?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, there's really not a great answer. So I've heard like
Yeah, there's really not a great answer for like anything really. It's like, well, it's kind of like a multitude of things, you know. It's like it's everything's kind of working together.
Yeah. I heard Diana Cox-Foster talk, and she found that there was a competition, but I've heard other people say there was. And so like anything with beekeeping, I guess, it's really dependent like on your area. So
Yeah, that's what like I always try to say. Like with like you can support both populations. I just think like if you're gonna forego to support both populations, you have to have enough resources for everybody. So you get rid of that competition and also dilute the possibility of this viral spillover as well, because maybe they're not pollinating the same flower.
yeah, the last thing I had was I guess let's say you're looking at, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of beekeepers are in like urban areas. And so I guess if you're in your HOA, for example, it might be difficult to have like a really nice pollinator garden. And so what are the things people can do like if you're in an urban area? Like is planting a pollinator garden enough? I've heard a lot of good research on bee lawns with like clover, for example. Like what can people do like in these urban environments where they always have to maintain like a really well manicured lawn, especially if they don't want to, piss off their neighbors.
Oh yeah, the HOA is great. Yeah, it's like exactly like you said, like plant native, maybe don't mulch the bed of your gardens, leave that exposed soil, have different flowers that bloom throughout the year, different heights, so you can like maybe like the lawn may be your sacrifice, but you can still make up for that in other different ways of the like pollinator gardens and like resources, leaving out a bee water dish, having that kind of thing out, just leaving enough resources out. Like maybe you have to mow the front yard, maybe if you want to leave the backyard, that's fine too, you know. But yeah, the clover, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. When I was in Indiana, the University of Minnesota had like this really nice bee lawn mixture, and it basically planted like Dutch clover into your grass, and so you can mow that, 5-6 times throughout the year, and it'll grow right back. And I always saw a lot of like bumblebees and other native bees on that. And so for me, that was kind of a good way to like have some forage for bees, but still be able to mow your lawn if you want a both.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's honestly one of the greatest. It's like, all right, like I can still mow, but you don't tell me what I have to mow,
Yep, exactly. Oh, then the last thing with the native bee nest, and so I guess I always get questions about people that are buying these like these nests from like a Home Depot, for example. How well do they work? Is there things that like to get the bees to establish in the nest? Because I've never seen bees established in those native bee homes.
Yeah, I always get that question too. It's like, how do I attract native bees to actually nest in there? I don't think there is a way to attract them to necessarily nest in there. I think they're going to go to it if they like it, if there's enough resources in the area. I've seen them mostly work with like cavity nesting wasps. They really seem to like it a lot. So a lot of the digger wasps that we were talking about earlier. I don't really have a good answer for that either. It's just like you put it out there, and if they like it, they'll like it. Maybe you might not have cavity nesting bees in your area, or maybe there's just not enough, and so they don't necessarily need that that habitat available for them. But yeah, it's always good to have it. Another interesting point is that they can't reuse the tunnels once somebody has nested in them. So it's always recommended like each year to take them apart and kind of like go through them with like a pipe cleaner or something like that to like get out all that necessary material, because they're not going to clean up their own cavities.
Yeah, Doty had a question. So what if you purchase the larva, so kind of pre-populate them? Or I guess pupa. You probably buy the overwintering pupa, like the mason bees or leafcutter bees.
Yeah, you could definitely. Yeah, you can buy those online. They come in little cocoons and stuff. So like when I did my undergraduate research, I literally got them from masonbeesforsale.com, where I got blue orchard mason bees. They also sell alfalfa leafcutter bees as well. So they don't. They come in. Yeah, you can use paper straws in those holes, and they come in the cocoons. They're not necessarily in the paper straws themselves. They just kind of come free. They put like some cotton on top. But when that environment comes to temperature and stuff, they'll actually emerge. And so it might be better if you have an incubator for example, to actually like hatch those bees, and then you can release them out into the area. But one caveat I would say to that, I would say make sure those bees are native to the area that you're in before you release them, because then that comes into another discussion of like invasive species, because now some of these leafcutter bees that have been imported to help pollinate some of our areas are now establishing populations, and now they're their own invasive species within that area, even though they technically are like, they're considered native bees, you know. So I would just like make sure, hey, like, are blue orchard mason bees native? Are alfalfa leafcutter bees native? I'm not sure. I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know of any other species that are commercially available for hatching, but I'm not sure. Going back to the original question, I'm not sure if pre-populating these cavities will necessarily get you the next generation of cavity nesting bees. They might hatch out of there. That doesn't mean they're going to use that same thing. You would just be pre-populating your area with cavity nesting bees for the chance that these guys might come back and nest. So there's no guarantee there.
Yeah, one thing I want to add too is, so if you're doing any like volunteer hours with a youth group or FFA or 4-H, like this is a perfect thing to do with those kids. And so I've worked with like some 4-H clubs, and I've had them make their own I guess like bee nests, and then I gave them these straws with the native bees, and then like a mason bee, for example, and kids really love it. Like, and parents aren't bothered by it because they're not going to sting you. So if you are giving a talk to like a youth group, for example, like having them make some of these, native bee nests and then buying some of these mason bees or leaf cutter bees is a really, really great option. Okay, do we have any other questions?
I was going to say I kind of updated because I gave a terrible answer for the monarchs earlier. But it's kind of like the mason bee nest, where you don't really want them reusing the straws for a lot of reasons. They can build up all kinds of things, but yeah, it was Xerces society. Yeah, protozoan. Apparently you don't want them to continuously have more generations and keep reproducing into the winter. So I posted that. Oh, and
yeah.
I was just,
I was going to talk about
that Pepsis thing. Sorry.
No, you're good. No, you're good.
The Pepsis sting is bad. I've experienced that one.
Oh, you have?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you survived. That's crazy.
I did. It was through a thick leather glove too.
Wow.
So yeah, they're fun.
I bet. Yeah. Yeah, they're like one of the top ones. Is like that, and bullet ants are the top stings and hymenopterans.
Mm-hmm.
Which is crazy. But yeah, what I was going to talk about was that protozoan. You reminded me of. I forget the species names, but it's called OE. Mm-hmm. That's the abbreviation, but that's like a real big threat for the monarchs, especially. So like the monarch capturing projects that a lot of people do, you'll capture wild monarchs on their migratory path, and you're actually able to tag them. And then also there's a test that you can do where you can actually look underneath a microscope for this protozoan just on like the wings themselves. So you don't actually have to kill them. It's like a very catch and release. You can like view them underneath the microscope. I think it's just like taking a swab of the scales off the wings. And that's also another cool project that you can do to help monitor these monarch populations. And you never know, somebody down in Mexico might find your tag. There's been a few times where these people have found tags and stuff. It's super rare, but you never know.
Well, perfect. Well, so Keegan, are you going to stay on, or you're going to jump off?
No, I can stay on.
Okay, it's really up to you. You either put your email into the chat so people can reach out to you, or I guess while I give the second part of the talk, you can answer any questions that people have. I think I answered them all. So if you have any more, feel free to speak up, or I'll move on. Okay, perfect. Let me share. Share my screen quick. Okay, can you see this okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so Keegan, once again, thank you for joining us today, talking about native pollinators and bees, especially here in the Lone Star State. Today, I'll talk about bees sort of around the world. And so we focus a lot on some of the solitary bees and some of the communal and primitively social bees that are found in Texas and other parts of the US. And now I'll talk about some other bees that are found across the world. And next week we'll be talking about genetics, and so I'll talk more about the subspecies or races of honeybees that are found in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and some that are found here in the U.S. And so today I'll kind of focus on Apidae and really some of the other species of Apis. So Keegan really explained this well, but I'll kind of cover it once again. So we talk about Hymenoptera. So Hymenoptera are an order of insects, and Hymenoptera include the vespids or the wasps and hornets, the Apidae, which are the bees, including honeybees and bumblebees, and then we have the ants, Formicidae. And so these are really the major, species under Hymenoptera. Now this is one of my favorite orders because there's a lot of different social groupings within Hymenoptera. And so, Keegan mentioned, solitary, we have communal, we have sort of semi-social, and we have these eusocial bees. And they have differences in sort of their life history and their cycle. They also have differences in mating behavior. So it's a really, really fascinating group. So we look at sort of the social livings within Hymenoptera. The one that we're all well aware of are eusocial insects. So this includes the honeybees, and there's very few, eusocial groups within Hymenoptera. And so there's different, Apis species that are eusocial, such as honeybees or other Apis species. But there are other eusocial species within the ants also. But when we think about eusocial, there's really, three definitions for eusocial. So number one is, the overlapping generations. So when you talk about bumblebees or some other, native bee species, they typically start as sort of a social group, and then that colony dies off, and then, the mated queen will go into the ground and start the cycle over again. So some of these species are switching from sort of a social state to a solitary state. Whereas honeybees, they have these overlapping generations. So we talked a lot about workers, only living 21 days. So that means that there's different workers taking their role. And so the colony really never collapses into one single bee. They're pretty much living these perennial colonies throughout the entire year. One thing with the eusocial colonies also are these reproductive castes. So we think about queens. Queens are the only individual within the colony that are reproductive and have the ability to lay eggs under most circumstances. And there's also non-reproductive castes, such as the workers. And so that's one thing that's really unique to honeybees are these reproductive caste systems. And as we get into bumblebees, I guess they can sort of have reproductive castes, but every bee within a bumblebee colony has the potential to become, an egg-laying queen. And so that's really the major difference is these clear castes within eusocial bees. And then we have this cooperative brood care where there's specialized workers within the colony, and their only role is to basically produce this jelly-like milk in their heads and feed and take care of the brood. And so they have individuals task force, and their only role is to take care of the brood, making sure they grow and they develop. Then we have sort of these social or semi-social insects, and Keegan talked a lot about wasps and bumblebees, so I won't go too much depth on those. But what that basically means is, there's like a social colony, but then that colony dies at the end of the fall or into the winter, and then the queen that's mated will go into the ground and start the nest over again. And so they're not eusocial in that they have these perennial colonies throughout the entire year. They're switching from a social state back into the solitary state. And so sometimes they can overlap in generations, but they typically don't have the overlapping generations like honeybees have. Reproductive castes. So what that means is the individual that becomes a queen is really based on aggressive. So typically the more aggressive bee will become the queen and really suppress reproduction from the rest of the workers. But if something happens to that queen or something happens to that individual, any of the wasps or the other bees have the opportunity to start laying eggs and really reproduce for the colony. So sometimes they have these clear reproductive castes. And then cooperative brood care, so they definitely have that. So within a wasp nest, for example, there's specialized bees that their role is to take care of the brood and make sure they're healthy and strong. Now, the majority of bees are these solitary bees and wasps, and so they don't have overlapping generations because these bees are really living on their own. Their goal is to, not only build the nest but forage, lay eggs, and they're basically doing everything. So they don't really have that social environment. They don't have the reproductive caste because that bee is in charge of really everything, and then they don't have the cooperative brood care. So I have a picture here of these wasps and or these mud daubers, these mud dauber wasps. And even though it seems like they kind of form these social colonies, they're actually kind of living individually. So I guess this would be an example of a communal type situation where, each wasp is kind of doing their own thing within these cells, but they're kind of living in one environment. And so that's one thing I really love about Hymenoptera is all these kind of social livings that they have, ranging from eusocial with honeybees all the way down to what most of the bees are these solitary bees. But one thing I'll really focus on are the corbiculate bees. So corbiculate is basically that large leg that allows bees to fly out and collect pollen or perfumes. And so one thing that honeybees are known for are these corbiculates on the back of their legs. And so they're quite a bit larger on workers versus queens, but they allow them to go to flowers and collect large amounts of pollen. And so when we talk about the corbiculate bees, I'll kind of focus on these 4 different species. And so we have the stingless bees, and one of the most common ones are Tetragonula carbonaria. This is found in Australia, but could be found in some parts of Mexico. We have Bombus, and so this is a picture of Bombus impatiens, but all Bombus species or bumblebees are these corbiculate bees. Obviously, we have Apis mellifera, which we all know about, and then Euglossa. And Euglossa are these kind of orchid bees. And so, but what's really cool about this is, honeybees are the only ones that are polyandrous. So they basically evolved polyandry independently of these other corbiculate bees. And so that means that typically, like the stingless bees, the bumblebees, and the orchid bees, they may mate with maybe 1 to a few males, but that's really about it. Whereas honeybees will mate with about 15 to 20 males. And as I talk about the other Apis species, some of them can mate with up to 75 to 100 males. So when you get to the giant honeybee, like Apis dorsata, they can mate with a lot of males. So they evolve this kind of multiple mating that's independent of other corbiculate bees. Honeybees also are eusocial, so meaning they have these perennial colonies, overlapping generations, and these reproductive castes. So one of my favorite bees are these stingless bees. The picture I showed you beforehand was this Tetragonula carbonaria. So they form these really cool, like kind of circular nests like this, and they heavily propolize the nest, but they can also produce a little bit of honey. You can see these really small workers come throughout, and then you see the queen right here. And so, yeah, like I said, they build the kind of these spiral nests, and we don't quite know why they build these spiral nests. There's probably some reason, but we're still learning more about it. But they're typically known as these sugar-baked bees, and they really behave similar to a honeybee colony, where there's a queen, and then these other workers are performing tasks within the colonies. But yeah, as you can see, this is these wax are typically, there's a mixture of wax, but they're also heavily propolized. And so they collect a lot more resin and produce propolis versus honeybees. So let me share this quick. So yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite types of bees. And so I talked about Tetragonula, but there's also Melipona. Recently, there's actually a Melipona or stingless bee that was found in San Francisco area. There's somebody that was using the iNaturalist app. I think it was like a 5 or 6-year-old girl that was using it as a school project, and she found a stingless bee in San Francisco that was imported for some reason. So, but typically they're not found in the U.S. So here's some different nests from different stingless bees. As you see, they have this circular spiral pattern. So it's a really cool nest. So if you ever get the opportunity to see them, if you're in parts of Mexico or in Australia, it's definitely worth the shot to check them out. And some people do maintain them. So the one thing is they're stingless, but they can be defensive. So like unlike honeybees, where honeybees have these kind of barbed stingers and they can actively pursue you, stingless bees, like their name, cannot sting, but they have certain defenses. So one way they defend their nest is through biting, but one way is to use this really sticky resin. So that's one way to defend their colony from any predators or anything that's trying to disturb their colony. They're also really excellent pollinators, especially in tropical regions. So we think about the crops that they're important for pollination. We talk about mango, we talk about coconut, and some of these tropical crops. And so they're really important pollinators in certain areas. They produce a really unique honey. Has anybody ever tried stingless bee honey? I'm not sure if anybody in chat has. If you have, let me know. I've never tried. I've always wanted to, but this was a researcher that I work with in Australia, and I guess they describe the honey as kind of this tangy flavor, but it's really valuable for its medicinal properties. It's also valuable because it's hard to produce as much honey from the stingless bees versus honeybees. So yeah, maybe at some point I can get some here, and then we can have a honey tasting. But the one difference that you should note is they have these really high resinous nests. They build nests in tree hollows, wall crevices, and even underground. And so kind of similar to honeybees, but instead they can also live underground. But they use a mixture of resin and wax to build these nests. But they really thrive in warm climates, so tropical environments. So they're mostly found in Southeast Asia and Australia. Like I said, there can be some stingless bee species in Mexico area. So really in these tropical environments. The next corbiculate bee are the orchid bees. And, I really love honeybees, but if I had to, I guess, point out one bee that's my second, it would definitely be the orchid bees. They're really, really cool bees. And I'll play a video here, but one way that males and females find each other is based on the perfumes that the males carry. So the males will go to all these different flowers, collect perfumes, and that's one way that they use to attract females during mating. But there's a really cool, I guess, co-evolutionary response between the orchids and these orchid bees.
An orchid. And I'm one of the most cunning of all flowers. My perfume is a trick. The orchid bee depends on me for help. With his central mission in life, to mate with a female.
Okay, let's see.
For weeks, he collects scent oils from orchids. Eventually, he uses his mix of fragrances as a kind of orchid cologne to attract a female. The scents come from me, a bucket orchid. The bucket is part of my trick. The bee has to climb a waxy slope to reach the scent oils cleverly hidden beneath a hood. I've filled my bucket with a sticky fluid that makes the bee sink. I provide only one escape route, which leads him just where I want. After the bee climbs out, I grip him tightly. I glue 2 pollen sacs to his back. each filled with tens of thousands of pollen grains. These are the only pollen sacs I will ever produce, so I won't let him go until the glue is dry. I may wait an hour or more before loosening my grip. This one bee now carries my legacy. When he comes upon the scent of another orchid that same day, he heads right for it. If he slips into the bucket of this second orchid, the pollen sacs on his back will come unglued. Pollination can occur. A new orchid generation can begin. How nature has created such intricate strategies is a mystery of life.
Yeah, so as you can see, the orchid really depends on these, orchid bees for pollination, but also, the orchid bee really needs those scents from those different orchids to attract a female. And so it's a really, really cool bee species. And, at time, these orchid bees can collect, 10 or 20 different scents because they're trying to get the perfect scents to attract the female. So they're really brilliantly colored. So, I guess we talked about sweat bees a little bit. So they're kind of that greenish color, but they have this really kind of metallic-y green color typically. They have, a mixture of blue metallic on their skin, but they seem to be kind of bluish, purplish, or even goldish colors. So they're really a really beautiful bee species. Like I said, they're perfume collectors. So the males are basically going to all these different orchids, collecting all these floral scents, and then storing them on their back of the leg so they can attract a female. And so, the female's basically saying, okay, which bee has the best perfume? So this one smells good. I'll go mate with this one. This one doesn't smell very good, so I won't go to this one. I guess it's kind of at a nightclub where you're trying to find the person with the best perfume. That's what bees are doing. They're really strong flyers, so they have, these strong, powerful wings that allow them to fly long distances. And so they can actually fly pretty long distances, but their goal is to collect as many different fragrances, and also the right fragrances to attract the mate. Now, there is one species that's found in the U.S., Wasp dilemma, and so they're found in the southern part of Florida. And so I work with a collaborator down there. The bees are really small, but if you ever get down to South Florida and able to find some of these orchid bees, it's a really, really beautiful bee to watch. And like I said, they're important pollinators, especially for orchids. So I won't go too much into bumblebees because I know Keegan talked a lot about bumblebees, but I just want to show kind of a quick video of what a bumblebee nest actually looks like. And if you're interested, I know you guys are all beekeepers. If you're interested in managing a bumblebee colony in your backyard, you can buy these bumblebee nests. Typically, they're bombus impatiens, maybe the other species, but I think typically they're bombus impatiens. But here's a nest. So you can see it's kind of more bubbly than kind of honeybee nest. And these are all workers that are basically nursing and taking care of the developing brood. There's typically one queen in the colony, and the queen is the one that's mating with maybe 1 to 3 males tops, and she's eggs. Like I said, it's basically the female or the queen is really aggressive, and so she kind of uses these aggressive signals to knock down reproduction from other workers. But something happens to that queen, then all these workers have the capacity to eventually lay eggs. Now, obviously, they're smaller. You can see the queen right here versus the workers, and so there's gonna be differences. But every worker has the capacity to reproduce, unlike honeybees. So yeah, there's diverse species. So what I found is about there could be 9 species of bumblebees, but there's probably more species of bumblebees in Texas. Maybe Keegan knows the exact number. I think I found 9, but it might be more here in Texas. They're important pollinators. So you talk about pollination. They're really important for buzz pollination. So Keegan talked about buzz pollination with alfalfa. Honeybees actually hate alfalfa because every time they get into the flower, they bump their head. And so it's really hard for them to get into the alfalfa flower, whereas bumblebees are really great with alfalfa. and some other crops too because of that buzz pollination. So, but they're really important pollinators for tomatoes, especially peppers and blueberries. Like we mentioned, the colonies are annuals. That means the entire colony dies off except for the new queen that actually overwinters into the ground. And so they switch from the solitary phase with the queen into kind of that kind of semi-social, primitively social stage. And then we talked a lot about declining populations and why that is. Okay, now we get into the apis bees. So the bees that we all know about and we all care about and we love, and I guess the main reason that we're all in this course is the Apis mellifera. So this is also known as the European honeybee, and this is really the managed honeybee across the entire world. But there's different apis species. So, apis is the genus, and then mellifera is the species name. But you can see these are some of the extant or the live apis species. So we have, Apis mellifera, but there's other cavity nesting honeybees. So these are bees that could kind of form a colony into a structure, sometimes into the ground or into a tree grove. And so these are the different, Apis species that are cavity nesting. The one that we talked about last week was Apis cerana. So, Varroa destructor Apis cerana was the original host for Apis or Varroa destructor. And so they've evolved a lot of really great defenses and resistance to Varroa because they've kind of evolved together for a very long time. And then we have the giant honeybees. So I'll only talk about Apis dorsata, but they're gigantic bees compared to honeybees or Apis cerana. They typically form kind of, I guess you can call them open air colonies, kind of like what we see here in Texas. But instead of having, multiple, I guess, frames of comb, they only form one, and they kind of live in these trees. And then we have the dwarf honeybees, so Apis florea, Apis adreniformis. So these are the two types of dwarf honeybees. But let's say we kind of focus on Apis mellifera, but there's a lot of other Apis species found across the world. And they're typically found in Asia, kind of these tropical environments. So first I'll talk about kind of Apis cerana. So like I mentioned, Apis cerana was the original host for Varroa destructor, and then eventually they jumped onto Apis mellifera and then caused all these problems that we have as beekeepers. But just like honeybees, Apis cerana can be managed for honey production. And so I just want to show kind of differences between, so these are kind of Italian honeybees or the European honeybees that we manage. That's kind of what they look like. And this is what Apis cerana looks like. So they look very similar. They are smaller than European honeybees. But yeah, they can be managed exactly the same way in these length stroke colonies. They can be managed for honey production, albeit they do produce less honey than European honeybees. But as you can see, the abdomens with these darker stripes, and they're also a little bit smaller than Apis mellifera. So here's kind of here's a picture. So this is Apis cerana versus Apis mellifera. As you can see, their abdomen has kind of darker colors compared to Apis mellifera. And then here's Apis dorsata, which is the giant honey, which I'll talk about later on. But yeah, so Apis cerana, its native ranges is south, and like I said, they were the original hosts for Varroa destructor. And so they've evolved these kind of behaviors, these social behaviors to deal with Varroa destructor. And so that includes grooming and hygienic behaviors. And so one thing that we do as researchers is really try to identify and understand those behaviors so we can breed for resistance to the Apis mellifera. Because there are some similarities in behaviors that Apis mellifera have, such as grooming and hygienic behavior. And so how can we learn more about Apis cerana and how they deal with Varroa, and how we can apply that to Apis mellifera and the managed colonies we have here in Texas? They're typically smaller, but they could be more defensive, especially when they're disturbed. So they tend to be a little bit more defensive than Apis mellifera, but as we'll talk a little bit more, there's different subspecies or races of Apis mellifera, and they can be more aggressive. And then they nest in cavities similar to honeybees. So they prefer to nest in tree hollows, but they can also be nested in man-made structures such as laying colonies. But the colonies tend to be a lot smaller, and they don't produce nearly as much honey as Apis mellifera or our European honeybee. Now we have Apis dorsata. So Apis dorsata live in these open air colonies. So beekeepers don't manage them in lengths colonies because they don't ever live in kind of these nest colonies. They live in the trees. And so if beekeepers do want to get honey from these giant hornets, they have to actually go to the trees and cut down the nest to collect any of the honey. But they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. But one thing they have is this shimmering pattern. Let me show it. So you see this shimmering right here? That's one way that they deter any predators away. So they form this shimmering pattern to basically deter any pests away, or any bears or anything that's trying to get into their nest. And so that's one way they defend the colony. Because you think about it, honeybees are kind of in this enclosed space, either a tree cavity or a managed colony, so they have that extra layer of protection. Whereas the Apis dorsata are living in a tree in these open air colonies. That exposes them to everything. So the environment exposes them to any predators, and so they evolve these really cool shimmering defenses to try to repel any predators. And so really one of the major predators are these hornet species. So hornets really love to eat them, as we talked about earlier on. And so one way that Apis dorsata repels any hornets is through this shimmering pattern. So Apis dorsata is really the largest honeybee species, and so picture of it early on. But they can reach up to 17 millimeters in length, so they're really, really large bees. That's why we call them the giant honeybees. They open in they're nest builders. They form these kind of open air colonies like this, and so they don't live in buildings or cavities or trees. They typically live on these tree branches. But they also tend to be highly defensive. And so they have these shimmering waves, like I said, to produce predators, but they can be aggressive, chase after you, and potentially sting you. Their mating is probably the part that I think really fascinates me. And so they have these drone congregation areas, similar to the Apis mellifera or honeybees that we manage, but there's some differences in them. So the honeybees that we manage, typically, the queens will typically mate with somewhere between 10 to 20 males, whereas these Apis dorsata these females will mate with maybe 75 to 100 males. So they have this really intensive mating behavior and mate with quite a few more, males versus honeybees. And I think one way they do that is because they're more exposed to the environment, to pathogens and parasites. So mating more often not only increases genetic diversity within a colony, but allows them to defend their colony from any pests, pathogens, and diseases. They also typically mate at dusk. And so they form these DCAs or these drone comets and mate, at dusk. And the mating only takes about 13 minutes. So, honeybees, the males and the females will fly, somewhere between 3 to 5 miles away, whereas the DCAs for the giant honeybees will be kind of near the colony. So they don't fly nearly as far away. But also one difference between the DCAs is with honeybees, the DCAs are sort of a mixture of drones from all these different apiaries, whereas dorsata, the males that are related to each other will form their own DCA, whereas males are related from a different colony will form their own DCA somewhere else. And so the males tend to congregate based on whether they're related or not to the other males within a colony. They're also seasonal migrators, so they can migrate extremely long distances. And so, they tend to abscond. So the entire colony leaves and flies to a different area. So they can spread and move really, really far distances. And so if there's something in an environment, so lack of resources, the weather changes, they'll tend to kind of fly and abscond and move to a new location. And so unlike honeybees where, they swarm, they won't fly as far away. These could fly, miles and miles away. Okay, so now we get into Apis mellifera. And so next week we'll talk about genetics. So I'll cover the subspecies a lot more, but there's about 20 different subspecies of Apis mellifera. And so these are kind of the native ranges of these Apis mellifera subspecies. So we know a lot in this orange. This is Apis mellifera mellifera, also known as a dark German honeybee. These were the bees that were first imported into the United States around the 1600s. So these were the first bees that we have. We don't see Apis mellifera much anymore. They've been kind of watered out by some of these other subspecies, but they were the original honeybees. One problem with Apis mellifera is they have really short tongues, and so they have a trouble with some of our native plants that we have here in the U.S., especially here in Texas. Ones that we know a lot about are the Italian honeybees, so Apis mellifera ligustica. So, when early settlers came to the United States, they wanted bees that not only produce a lot of wax for their candles, but also produce more honey. And so Apis mellifera ligustica, or Italian bees, started being introduced. And then we have Apis mellifera carnica, which are what we like to call the carniolan honeybees, or some of these darker bees. These are imported because they were more tolerant to the weather conditions in the Midwest and the colder climates. Let's all say there's about 20 different subspecies across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And because these subspecies were in these regions for a very long time, they become sort of acclimated and adapted to the region. And so that's why when we talk about Italian honeybees, Carniolan honeybees, Russian honeybees, they have different traits because of where they were imported from and what they were adapted to. And so, like I said, we'll get into this a lot more next week when we cover genetics and talking about which genetics we have here in the US. So when you talk about importation, honeybees, as we knew it, were first imported around 1622 around the Virginia area. And so, early settlers first brought in, Apis mellifera. And so they were sort of this dark German bee. And they're typically imported for multiple reasons. Either they were kind of swarms or bee colonies on a ship, or they're brought in for honey production or even wax. And so, for certain religious sectors, wax was really important. And so they needed bee colonies to produce wax. And so as I talk more about the Catholic religion, wax played a really important role for Catholics. And so honeybees obviously produce really high quality wax and were one of the major reasons for importation. But yeah, when we talk about these different importation events, it really started in the 1600s and then into the 1700s as settlers started moving farther and farther west. They brought honeybees with them, right? So they not only brought, their dogs or animals with them, they also brought some of their honeybee colonies further west. And as they moved further and further west, they sort of realized that, especially if they're in the Midwest, like Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that they needed more hardier bees. So they started bringing in, Italian honeybees or Apis mellifera ligustica. And then, by the kind of mid-hundreds, they made their way all the way into the western part of the United States. But as you can see in Texas, and I'll talk about this more in the history section, the history of beekeeping in Texas, but honeybees were basically started importing around 1834 with the Austin colonies. So as the Austin colonies started to form in Texas, they brought honeybees with them. When I look at the Native Americans that were in Texas, I didn't see any records of them managing honeybees, before 1834. The only records I started seeing was, when the early settlers came to Texas with the Austin colonies or Tennessee colonies. And then another importation event in 1845 in further West Texas. But one thing to note here is that around the 1980s or so, Africanized honeybees made their way from South America into Texas. Yeah, so this map basically shows that these are kind of the known importation events for bees in North America. So, and I guess what Keating mentioned that we always assumed that honeybees were, not native to the United States, that the reason that we have honeybees in the US is because they were imported from these different importation events across the country. So here are the different subspecies, and like I mentioned, we'll talk about this a lot more next week. So we have Italian honeybees, which are Apis mellifera ligustica. One thing beekeepers really like about them is they grow really fast, they form these really large colonies, and they produce a lot of honey. And so that's one reason that they were first imported, and one reason that beekeepers really love Italian honeybees. Some of the downsides is they don't have the grooming or hygienic behavior, and so they're more prone to varroa. They're also more prone to a lot of brood diseases and other pests and pathogens. And so, even though there's some upside with Italian honeybees, there is a lot of downsides. Carnica started being introduced as settlers moved into the Midwest and colder regions because they're more tolerant to the weather conditions. And one benefit of these is they shut down really fast in the fall, and so they don't form these large colonies over winter. They also don't, brood up as fast as Italian honeybees. So when you think about Texas, we have, kind of these cold spells, but then we have these warm spells where the queen starts brooding up and going through the honey stores. The Carnica or Carniolan honeybees don't start brooding up and going through the honey stores as fast as Italian honeybees. And so that's one benefit of having Carniolan bees or some genetics throughout the winter. And then we have the black bees, the dark German bees, so the Apis mellifera mellifera. So like I mentioned, these were first introduced into the United States, and they weren't that desirable once they got to the U.S. The early settlers, early beekeepers didn't really like them that much. They didn't produce a lot of honey. They weren't really great at overwintering. Their short tongues cause issues as they're getting to the plants and collecting nectar, and so they've been kind of phased out. And we don't see much of the Apis mellifera mellifera genetics in the U.S. I know Juliana's lab has done some studies, and Dr. Brock Harper's lab at Purdue has some studies where they found some Apis mellifera mellifera in some of these forests, but we don't see much of the genetics anymore. And then we have Apis mellifera scutellata, which are the Africanized honeybees. So we've all heard about Africanized honeybees. They tend to be a bit more defensive. They but they also tend to have higher grooming behavior and more hygienic behavior. So even though they may be more aggressive, they have a better tolerance and resistance to varroa and some other diseases. And then, we talk about Caucasian honeybees, so Apis or caucasica. They're kind of similar to Carniolans. I'm not sure if any beekeepers have ever ran or purchased Caucasian honeybees, but they can be a little different than Carniolans. So these are kind of the major subspecies that were introduced into the United States. We've had some other ones in Texas specifically, like the Egyptian honeybee, Lamarckii. And so some of these Egyptian honeybee genetics are found actually in the Sam Houston forest. And so we do have some other imported subspecies into the United States. Okay, so one question that a researcher at the Logan USC ARS facility kind of posed was, are honeybees actually native to the United States? And so we've always assumed that the reason honeybees are in the US is because they're imported from these different importation events. But new research, which I'll talk about from her lab and the USDA Baton Rouge lab that I worked at, maybe kind of telling a different story, that honeybees may be sort of native to the United States. So one of our questions was, were honeybees actually first introduced in 1622, or were they introduced, earlier? So, 1622 was when the early settlers made their way into the United States and brought honeybees with them. But, if you think about when settlers from Spain first came to Mexico, that they probably brought bees with them during the early 1500s. And so, our early reports was that honeybees were first imported into the United States around 1622. But there's a really good chance that they were actually imported earlier, even before the Spanish even made it into the United States. And I'll talk about a little bit more about the history and the historical data found in Mexico, and it tells a really fascinating story. Because if they were imported into Mexico before 1622, then those bees probably made it up to the United States, and people may have been managing bees for longer than we expected. But then also maybe bees really evolved in the United States, and they're actually based in the United States, and so maybe they are native to the U.S. other than what we ever thought. And so the reason behind this is there was a fossil that was found in Nevada. This publication, I think it was 2009, it was published, but they found this fossil in Nevada. It's called Apis nearctica. And this fossil was from about 14 million years ago. And the one thing to consider about Nevada and Utah, this used to be a highly tropical environment, and there used to be sort of a landmass that connected the Western U.S. into Asia. And so when they found this fossil, it kind of changed our whole viewpoint about honeybees and whether they're native to Asia or whether they might be native to the United States. And so there's some really great bee morphologists and taxonomists that I looked at this fossil, and they found very similarities between Apis nearctica to Apis mellifera that we manage now. So the wing venation is very similar. You can kind of see the abdomen right here, so the different tergites. And so all the features are very similar to Apis mellifera. The one thing to note here too is that this is definitely a corbiculate bee. You see the corbicula on the back of its leg. and this was used to collect pollen and so on. And so what could have happened is that, Apis nearctica really kind of evolved in the US. And then as the environment and landscape changed from the tropical environment to what we see now in Nevada and Utah, that the bees basically absconded and started moving west to where the tropical environment was. And so this really changes the way we think about honeybees and whether they're actually native or maybe they were non-native to the US. And so one thing I always look at is the biodiversity of bees in Asia. And so as the color gets darker and darker red, this is a higher species richness. So that means there's more bee species in these areas. And if you look at sort of Asia area, they have an extremely high biodiversity. And it's because of the tropical environment, the heat, the humidity, and this allows a lot of bee species to really thrive. And so there's a high diversity here in Asia. And one of our thoughts was that the bees really formed in Asia and then spread into Africa and Europe, and then formed, these 20 or some subspecies. And then eventually, as settlers moved into the United States, that they were kind of imported around the 1600s. But what could have happened is that bees were actually formed in Nevada or the Western United States, and then they maybe absconded into Asia, when there's a landmass connecting the two. And then once that happened, the bees were no longer able to thrive in, Nevada or Utah area, and really started growing and evolving in the Asia area. And so this is kind of one hypothesis that some research started looking into, is that maybe honeybees really, really evolved into United States, and then they eventually spread into Asia, Africa, and Europe. So let's go to Mexico, because I think Mexico can tell a lot of information about whether there was one, an earlier importation events, or two, maybe there was some of these descendants from Apis nearctica in the US at one point. So Spanish settlers first arrived into Mexico and the Caribbean around the 1500s. So when you think about the importation events into the United States, we talk about 1622 is when the first reports of importation really occurred. But Spanish settlers were going to Mexico and Caribbeans, as early as the 1500s, and they brought bees with them primarily for wax. And so, really, as some of these religions were really using wax candles and wax for a lot of their religious services, honeybee wax was really valuable, because when you heat up the wax, it becomes that really nice color. It doesn't burn when you heat it, and so a lot of people like the honeybee wax. And so, as I talked about the stingless bees, you can get wax from that, but it's kind of a dark black color and has a really weird smell. And so a lot of people prefer the honeybee wax versus the stingless bee wax. And so because of that, there's some historical records that, okay, this wax is a different color. It doesn't really match with the stingless bees. And there's also records that, honeybees were around in Mexico long, long before some of these importation events. And so we think with the Mayans, for example, there's some evidence that they were actually beekeepers, and that they might have been managing honeybees rather than just stingless bees. And so that, I guess that means two things: that one, there's some early descendants in Mexico, but also two, maybe there's an earlier importation event into Mexico. And so I guess why is there historical data about honeybees before some of these importation events? So one is there could be descendants of Apis nearctica. And so, I guess they could have been around the Nevada area, but as the temperature, the landscape became really harsh for them, they absconded not only into Asia, but maybe absconded down into Mexico. And then people were just managing those honeybees into Mexico before they eventually became extinct. Or there were some additional importations that we don't know about. Okay, so how does this relate to Texas, right? So, Keegan talked a lot about this and sort of a lack of, bee sampling across the United States. So the larger square, the darker the blue color, these are regions where there's a lot of sampling and we know a lot about the bee species. So as you can see from this map, there's a lot of white. And so there's a lot of regions where we don't know much about the bee species in those regions. Now, if you go to Texas, there's a few spots. I mean, we have kind of Houston area, kind of Lubbock area, a little bit of southern Texas area, but overall Texas is very white. Now, if beekeepers were managing Apis nearctica, at some point in Mexico, there's a really good chance that some of these descendants could be in the southern Mexico part. Now, we're probably expecting some of these descendants are probably in Nevada, maybe parts of New Mexico, but there's a really good chance that some of these descendants and genetics from these descendants may be found in the southern part of Texas. And so, I get a lot of questions from feral colonies, from beekeepers, and about the traits and genetics they have. And that's one thing that we need to look a bit more into. So sampling some of these feral colonies in southern part of Texas, and to see if they have any genetics from Apis nearctica or some of these other extinct species. So one thing that I'd like to look at, I think Juliana's looked at this a little bit, is, I guess when I'm not sure how many people have taken a genetic test, like a 16B test, but they always talk about the Neanderthal genetics that you have, right? So this is an extinct human that has some genetics that were passed on to, us humans today. Now, it could be possible that Apis nearctica some of the genetics are actually still found in Apis mellifera that we manage today. And so it would be really cool to kind of sequence the genetics of bees across Texas and see if some of these genetics from Apis nearctica or even other extinct bee species are still found in Texas. And so, some of these feral populations or feral colonies could be really great reservoirs for some of these genetics and really understanding, what was here and what wasn't here beforehand. And so, it'd be really cool to do some sequencing and find some of these colonies, these feral colonies, to see if they have some of these, extinct genetics, and see if we can kind of bring this history together and better understand, are honeybees native to the United States, or were they imported earlier on, and maybe start answering some of these questions. Okay, so I touched on genetics a little bit more, so I'll talk a little bit more about genetics next week. But yeah, so next week from 9 to 12 on Tuesday, we'll talk about honeybee genetics, and so that ranges from everything about like what the heck is genetics, talk about genetic testing, and then a little bit more into subspecies. And with that, I will take any questions if we have any. I think we have 15 minutes. Okay, so Autumn said, so are killer bees still Apis mellifera since they can crossbreed? Yeah, so we talk about killer bees, right? They're Africanized honeybees. So there'd be Apis mellifera scutellata. The ones that we think about purchasing are the Italian honeybees or Ligusica. Now, with honeybees in the United States, they're basically mutts. And so I'd say pretty much any bee that you find in Texas has a little bit of Africanized genetics. And I'll talk about that a little bit more next week about how Africanized honeybees are here in Texas. I've seen some reports where some bees here in Texas have maybe 20% Africanization in Texas. And so I haven't seen any that are 100% Africanized, but there may be some in certain parts of Texas. So Lynn Jones said, the honey I have tasted from Singlets bee was very citrusy, which isn't surprising since this was Cosmozel. Yeah, cool. I'm glad you tried it. I'd love to try it sometime. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I guess I figured I'd talk about this. I just heard this talk, and there's some new research about how honeybees could be native to the United States, and so I guess I'm rethinking about how I teach some of this stuff, because I always assumed that they were non-native to the United States and imported. So we're still learning more and more about honeybees and really where they came from. But one problem is it's really hard to find these fossils. There's been very few honeybee fossils found throughout the world, so it's hard to kind of put everything together. Then Kathy had a question, are there Mexican honey wasps here? And yeah, Donna answered the question, so yes, there are, especially in the southern part of Texas. Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions for me, or I guess Keegan's still on the call? Okay, Lee had a question about, let's see. So Lee says, I go to Belize fairly often. Belizean government is highly protective of their bee colonies. Yeah. Are you referring to like honeybee colonies? Oh, I think he's trying to talk, but I can't hear anything. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know much about Belize specifically. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I do know that in Puerto Rico, for example, their bees are pretty much 100% Africanized, so they're extremely docile and easy to work with. So even though they're Africanized, they're not as aggressive or defensive as the Africanized honeybees that we find in South America or into the United States. And so one reason that they might be really protective is they don't want any bees coming into Belize to mess with the genetics. Another reason is I'm not sure. I guess I believe they have Roa in Belize, but they don't. Maybe having closed borders is one way to prevent Roa from getting into Belize, or triple laps, which is another mite getting into Belize. Maybe it's a reason to protect them from any viruses or anything else. And so that could be one reason. I don't know much about Belize and the honeybee industry. Kate, you had a question?
Hi, this is her.
Oh, I think she's.
Did you get my questions?
Do you leave them in the chat?
CO2.
CO2. Let's see.
I don't see on neck area if possible.
I think she's talking on the phone. She needs to mute out.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about CO2. I was. Let me mute. Okay. Okay, perfect. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So if you have any other questions after this, feel free to shoot me an email. If you have a question for Keegan, shoot him an email. But and once again, thank you, Keegan, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, thank you all for having me. It's been awesome.
All right, thank you, everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you.